The snow fell in thick, merciless sheets across the Colorado mountainside, each flake a tiny blade against Janet Murphy's face as she stumbled through the darkness. Her hands, raw and bleeding from clawing at frozen bark and jagged stone, reached desperately ahead of her into the void that had become her world 3 days ago. The fever that had stolen her sight burned behind her eyes like twin coals, leaving her with nothing but the howling wind and the treacherous crunch of snow beneath her worn boots. She had been traveling with the wagon train to Denver when the sickness took hold. First came the headaches, sharp and splitting, then the fever that made her skin feel like it was on fire, even as her body shook with chills. By the second day, shadows began creeping in from the edges of her vision. By the third morning, the world had gone completely black. The other travelers, terrified that whatever afflicted her might spread, had left her behind at the last supply station with nothing but a few provisions and hollow promises that someone would come back for her. No one had come back. Janet pressed her back against what felt like a massive pine tree, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. The cold bit through her thin woolen coat, and she could feel ice crystals forming on her eyelashes. Somewhere in the distance, she heard the lonely howl of wolves, and her blood turned to ice water in her veins. She had been walking for hours, maybe days, she could no longer tell. Time had become meaningless in this world of endless night. Her fingers traced the rough bark behind her, searching for any landmark that might tell her where she was or which direction to go. But every tree felt the same, every rock formation indistinguishable from the last. She was lost in a wilderness that could kill her in a dozen different ways, and she could not see any of them coming. The sound of breaking branches made her freeze. Something large was moving through the forest, and it was coming her way. Janet pressed herself harder against the tree trunk, trying to make herself invisible, trying not to breathe. The footsteps were deliberate, measured, not the random wandering of an animal. Someone was out there in the storm, and they were tracking something. Or someone. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the footsteps grew closer. She could hear heavy breathing now, the crunch of snow under what sounded like large boots. Janet's hand moved instinctively to the small knife at her belt, though she knew it would be useless against a man who could see while she could not. The approaching figure stopped, and she held her breath until her lungs burned. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. A voice cut through the wind, deep and rough like gravel over stone. I know you are there. Come out where I can see you. Janet's grip tightened on her knife, but she remained silent. The voice did not sound cruel, but she had learned that appearances could deceive, and voices even more so. Men could speak gently while their hands dealt violence, could offer help while planning harm. Quote unknown, the voice continued, closer now. Quote tuon. The words hit her like a physical blow. He had been watching her, tracking her movements while she stumbled helplessly through the forest. The knowledge that she had been so exposed, so vulnerable, made her stomach turn. But something in his tone gave her pause. There was no mockery there, no cruelty, just a statement of fact, delivered with the weight of someone who understood the mountains and their dangers. Quote 3, she called out, surprised by how weak her own voice sounded. Hoshiam, Janet tried to place his accent. There was something different about the way he spoke, a careful precision to his words that suggested English was not his first language. Spanish, perhaps, though his pronunciation was clear and careful. Quote 5, she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she realized how foolish they sounded. Trouble had found her regardless of what she was looking for. Henry replied. She heard him take a step closer, and every muscle in her body tensed. Kudam, she warned, raising her knife, though she could not see where to point it. The footsteps stopped immediately. Kutan, he said, and again there was that careful, measured tone. Kudafem, Janet knew he was right. She could already feel the cold seeping into her bones, could feel her fingers growing numb despite her gloves. But accepting help from a stranger in the wilderness was almost as dangerous as facing the elements alone. She had heard too many stories of women who had trusted the wrong man and paid with their lives. Quote 11, she said, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the whistle of wind through the trees. When Henry spoke again, his voice was gentler, though no less serious. Quote 12, he asked. The question caught her off guard. She had been trying so hard to hide her blindness, to appear strong and capable, that she had not considered whether it was obvious to someone watching her movements. Quote 13, she lied. Another pause. Quote 14, Henry said quietly. Quote Garm. Janet's heart sank. She stretched her foot forward cautiously and immediately felt the obstacle he had described. Her deception had been useless, transparent to someone who knew what to look for. The fever took your sight, Henry said, and it was not a question. Janet's shoulders sagged in defeat. There was no point in pretending anymore. She admitted. She heard him curse softly in what sounded like Spanish. Botan, he said. Quote 20. The anger in his voice surprised her. It was not directed at her, but at those who had abandoned her. She had expected judgment, perhaps mockery of her weakness. Instead, she heard genuine outrage at the injustice done to her. Quote 21. Janet said, though the words lacked conviction, she was lost, blind, and freezing in a wilderness that wanted to kill her. If that was not helpless, it was close enough to make no difference. Henry agreed. Janet weighed her options, though the choice was really no choice at all. She could continue wandering blindly through the storm until the cold or the wolves or the cliffs claimed her, or she could trust this stranger who had found her in the darkness. Neither option offered any guarantee of safety, but at least one offered the possibility of survival. She asked. Henry replied simply. The straightforward honesty of his answer struck her. There was no calculation in it, no hint of expectation or demand, just a simple statement of what he saw as his duty. Janet had known few men who spoke with such directness, without layers of meaning beneath their words. Taya, she said carefully, quote turn. Henry said immediately. Quote crown. Janet tried to read deception in his tone but found none. Either he was an exceptionally skilled liar, or he meant exactly what he said. In her experience, men who offered help to women usually expected payment of one kind or another, whether in coin or in flesh. The idea that someone might help her simply because she needed help seemed almost too good to be true. She asked, quote 33. Henry admitted. Quote 34. The blunt truth of his words cut through her hesitation. She was going to die out here if she did not accept help. And soon. Whatever risk this man represented, it could not be worse than the certainty of death that awaited her in the storm. Quote 35, she said quietly. Quote 30, she heard him move closer and her hand tightened on her knife again out of instinct, but his voice remained calm and unthreatening. Quote 37, he said. Quote 30, and Janet nodded, though she realized he might not be able to see the gesture in the storm. She felt his hand close around her elbow, large and warm even through her coat. His grip was firm, but not painful. The touch of someone accustomed to guiding others through dangerous terrain. Henry said. They began to move through the forest, Henry's steady presence beside her, the only thing that kept her from panic as they navigated what felt like an obstacle course of fallen trees, hidden rocks, and sudden drops. Several times she felt the ground give way slightly beneath her feet, and Henry's grip would tighten, steadying her before she could fall. Quote 41. He warned as they approached what sounded like running water. Quote 42. Janet felt him guide her foot to what must have been a stepping stone, then another, his other hand moving to her waist to keep her balanced. The water rushed beneath them, invisible but audible, and she tried not to think about what would happen if she slipped and was swept away in the current. Quote 43. Henry said as they reached the other side. Quote Janet could smell wood smoke now, carried on the wind, and the scent filled her with a longing so intense it was almost painful. Warmth, shelter, safety, all the things that had seemed impossibly distant just minutes ago. She found herself walking faster, eager to reach this sanctuary Henry had promised. Quote 45. He warned, his grip tightening again. Quote 46. Janet felt her foot touch wood, then another step, then another. A porch, she realized, with a roof that cut off the falling snow. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. Henry guided her to what felt like a heavy wooden door, and she heard the scrape of a key in a lock. Henry said as the door swung open. The warmth hit her like a physical embrace, and Janet nearly sobbed with relief. She could hear the crackle of a fire somewhere ahead, could smell food cooking, could feel the blessed absence of wind and snow. Henry guided her inside and closed the door behind them, And for the first time in days, Janet felt truly safe. Henry said, leading her to what felt like a wooden chair near the fire. Quote 49. Janet hesitated for a moment, then allowed him to help her out of the wet, frozen garment. She could feel the heat from the fireplace beginning to penetrate her chill body, and she held her hands toward what she assumed was the source of the warmth. Quote 50. Henry observed, and she felt him take one of her hands gently in his own. Quote 51. Quote 50. Janet said. Quote found. Quote Sharon. Henry said simply. Quote washes. Janet heard him move away, then returned with what sounded like a basin of water and some cloth. She tensed as he began to clean the cuts on her palms, expecting pain, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. Quote 56. He warned before applying what smelled like some kind of antiseptic. Janet bit back a gasp as the medicine burned her raw flesh, but the pain was clean and sharp, the kind that meant healing rather than harm. Henry worked methodically, cleaning each cut thoroughly before wrapping her hands in what felt like clean bandages. Quote 57, he said when he was finished. Quote 58. Quote Janet said and meant it. When was the last time someone had tended to her injuries with such care? She could not remember. Quote 16, Henry asked. Quote 16, Janet's stomach clenched at the mention of food. She had been surviving on the few provisions the wagon train had left her, and those had run out yesterday. Yes, she said, I am very hungry. She heard him ladling something into a bowl, then felt him press it into her hands along with a spoon. The bowl was warm, almost hot, and the smell that rose from it made her mouth water. Beef and vegetables, seasoned with herbs she could not identify, but that smelled wonderful. Janet ate slowly, partly because she was still learning to navigate food without being able to see it, and partly because she wanted her to savor every bite. The stew was indeed simple, but it was the most delicious thing she had tasted in weeks. Henry sat across from her. She could hear him eating as well, but he did not try to make conversation while she focused on her meal. Better? He asked when she had finished. Much better, Janet replied. Thank you. I cannot remember the last time I had a proper hot meal. The wagon train did not feed you well? Janet hesitated. The truth was complicated, and she was not sure how much she wanted to reveal to this stranger who had shown her such unexpected kindness. But something about Henry's straightforward manner made her want to be honest with him. Quote, she admitted. Quote, and Henry asked, and again she heard that anger in his voice. Quote 7, Janet said. Quote, Janet touched her eyes gently. Quote 70, Janet considered this. She had been so focused on the blindness and the cold and the fear that she had not really taken stock of her other symptoms. But Henry was right. The burning heat that had consumed her for days was gone, leaving only the darkness behind. Henry said, quote, I want 79. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Janet found herself relaxing for the first time in days, her body finally beginning to warm through. She could feel exhaustion creeping up on her, the kind of bone-deep weariness that comes after days of fear and struggle. Henry said, as if reading her thoughts. Janet asked, suddenly aware that she was in a strange man's home with no idea of the layout or the sleeping arrangements. There is a bed in the back room, Henry said. It is clean and warm. I will sleep out here by the fire. Janet felt a flush of embarrassment. Of course he would give her the bed. She had been thinking like someone who expected the worst from every situation, when this man had shown her nothing but kindness and respect. You do not have to sleep by the fire in your own home, she said. I can make do with a blanket on the floor. No, Henry said firmly, you are my guest, and you have been sick. You will take the bed. There was no arguing with his tone, and Janet found she did not really want to argue anyway. The thought of a real bed with warm blankets and a soft mattress was almost too wonderful to contemplate. Henry stood, and she heard his footsteps moving away. Come, Mon said. I will show you where everything is. Janet rose carefully and followed the sound of his voice. She felt him take her elbow again, guiding her through what must have been the main room of the cabin and down a short hallway. The bedroom is here, Henry said, stopping and opening what sounded like another door. The bed is straight ahead, about 6 steps. There is a chamber pot in the corner if you need it during the night, and a wash basin on the table by the window. Janet stepped carefully into the room, counting her paces. 6 steps brought her to the edge of what felt like a substantial bed with a thick mattress and heavy quilts. "There are clean night clothes that's in the chest at the foot of the bed," Henry continued. "They will be too large for you, but they are warm and dry." "Thank you," Janet said. "You have been very kind." "Rest well," Henry replied. "We can talk more in the morning when you have slept." She heard his footsteps retreat and the soft sound of the door closing. Janet stood alone in the darkness that was no different from the darkness she had lived in for days, but somehow felt less frightening here in this warm, safe place. She found the chest Henry had mentioned and opened it carefully. Inside were what felt like woolen shirts and thick socks, all clean and smelling faintly of cedar. Janet selected what seemed to be the smallest shirt and a pair of socks, then sat on the edge of the bed to change. Her own clothes were damp with snow and sweat, and it felt wonderful to peel them off and replace them with the dry, warm garments Henry had provided. The shirt hung almost to her knees, and the sleeves had to be rolled up several times, but it was the most comfortable thing she had worn in weeks. Janet slipped under the quilts and immediately sank into the softest mattress she had felt in months. The bed was warm, obviously heated by the fire in the main room, and the quilts were thick and heavy. She pulled them up to her chin and let herself truly relax for the first time since the fever had taken her sight. But even as her body settled into the blessed comfort of the bed, her mind remained active. Who was Henry Garcia, and why did he live alone in these remote mountains? What had brought him here, and what kind of life did he lead in this isolated place? His English was careful and precise, suggesting education, but his hands had been rough and calloused when he tended her wounds, the hands of a man who worked hard for his living. And why had he helped her? Janet had learned to be suspicious of men who offered aid without obvious reason, but Henry seemed genuinely motivated by simple human decency. Either he was an exceptionally good actor, or he was that rarest of creatures, a truly good man. Janet tried to remember the last time she had encountered such straightforward kindness. Her husband had been dead for 2 years now, killed in a mining accident that had left her with nothing but debts and the clothes on her back. Since then, she had been on her own, working whatever jobs she could find, always moving west toward the promise of a better life that seemed to stay just out of reach. The men she had encountered in that time had been of various types. Some had been kind enough in their way, but always with expectations attached. Others had been openly predatory, seeing a woman alone as an opportunity to be exploited. A few had been genuinely decent, but those had been rare enough that she remembered each one clearly. Henry Garcia seemed to fall into that last category, but Janet had learned to be cautious about such judgments. Men could present one face while harboring entirely different intentions. She would need to remain alert, ready to defend herself if necessary, even as she accepted his hospitality. But for now, she was warm and fed and safe, and that was more than she had dared hope for when she was stumbling through the forest just hours ago. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would face it with more strength than she had today. Janet closed her eyes, though the gesture was purely symbolic in her world of perpetual darkness, and let herself drift toward sleep. The last thing she heard before unconsciousness claimed her was the distant sound of Henry moving around the main room, banking the fire for the night, preparing to sleep on the floor of his own home so that a stranger might have his bed. The gesture struck her as profoundly decent, and she fell asleep thinking that perhaps, for once, she had been fortunate enough to encounter one of the good ones. Janet woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, and for a moment she could not remember where she was. Then the events of the previous night came flooding back. The storm, the stranger who had found her, the warm cabin that had saved her life. She sat up carefully, listening to the sounds of someone moving around what must be the kitchen. "Good morning," Henry's voice called from the other room. "Quote one," and Janet replied, and it was true. She had slept more deeply and peacefully than she had in weeks, her body finally able to relax in safety and warmth. "Quote one, Henry said. "Quote one." Janet found her clothes from the previous night, now dry from hanging near the fire. They were wrinkled but clean, and she changed back into them reluctantly, missing the comfort of Henry's oversized shirt. She made her way carefully to the main room, using the walls to guide her. "Good morning," Henry said as she emerged from the bedroom. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than I have in a very long time." Janet admitted. Thank you for giving me your bed. It was nothing, Henry replied. Sit, and I will bring you coffee. Janet found the chair she had occupied the night before and settled into it. A moment later, she felt a warm mug pressed into her hands. The coffee was strong and black, exactly what she needed to clear the fog of sleep from her mind. How are your hands this morning? Henry asked. Janet flexed her fingers carefully. The cuts still stung, but the sharp pain of the night before had faded to a dull ache. Much better, she said. Thank you for tending to them. It was necessary, Henry said simply. Infected wounds can be dangerous, especially out here where medical help is scarce. Janet sipped her coffee and listened to Henry moving around the kitchen. She could hear him flipping what sounded like bacon in a pan, the sizzle and pop of grease, the scrape of a spatula against metal. The domestic sounds were comforting, reminding her of the home she had shared with her husband before his death. May I ask you something? Janet said. Of course. Why do you live up here alone? It must be a hard life, isolated from other people. Henry was quiet for a moment, and Janet wondered if she had overstepped some boundary, but when he spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than offended. I came here 5 years ago, he said. I was looking for a place where a man could live quietly, without interference from others. Are you running from something? Janet asked, then immediately regretted the question. It was too personal, too presumptuous. But Henry did not seem offended. In a way, yes, he said, though not from the law, if that is what you are wondering. I am running from the kind of life that demands a man be something he is not. Janet considered this cryptic answer. There was pain in Henry's voice, old hurt that had driven him to seek solitude in these remote mountains. She wanted to ask more, but something in his tone warned her that he had said as much as he was willing to say on the subject. Quote 123. Henry asked, turning the conversation back to her. Quote 24. Quote 25. Janet said. Quote 126. Quote 27. Henry said, and she could hear genuine sympathy in his voice. Quote 128. They fell into a comfortable silence, broken only by the sounds of Henry finishing breakfast. Soon Janet smelled eggs cooking alongside the bacon, and her stomach rumbled in anticipation. Quote what Henry said. Quote 30 and quote wordman. Janet admitted. A few minutes later, she felt a plate being placed in front of her, along with a fork. The food smelled wonderful, and Janet ate with enthusiasm, savoring the simple pleasure of a hot, well-cooked meal, she said between bites. Henry replied. When they had finished eating, Henry cleared the dishes, and Janet heard him washing them in what must have been a basin of water. She sat by the fire, listening to the domestic sounds and trying to figure out what she should do next. Quote 136, she said, when he had finished with the dishes. Quote 137 or to quote 138, quote 139. Janet took a deep breath. Quote 140. Henry was quiet for a long moment, and Janet's heart sank. She had been hoping against hope that the blindness was temporary, that when the fever broke, her vision would return. But Henry's silence suggested otherwise. He said finally. Janet said, it was not a question. Henry said gently. Janet nodded, though her throat felt tight with unshed tears. She had known deep down that her sight was probably gone forever. But hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that her private fears had not. Quote 146, she asked, and her voice came out smaller than she had intended. Quote 47, Henry said. Quote on quote 14, Janet said bitterly. Quote 50, Henry agreed. Quote what one. Janet looked up, though she could not see his face. Quote Watstusen, quote Wantrun, Henry said simply. Quote Waterman. The offer hit Janet like a physical blow. Stay here? In this isolated cabin with a man she had known for less than 24 hours? It was impossible, unthinkable, completely improper, she said automatically. Henry said. Janet struggled to find words. The truth was that the offer was tempting beyond measure. Where else could she go? What else could she do? A blind woman alone had few options in this world, and most of them were grim. Quote 160, she said finally. Quote wow and a yawn. Henry replied, please. Quote when. Quote one. Quote one. Janet considered this. It sounded almost too good to be true. A partnership that would benefit them both. But she had learned to be suspicious of arrangements that seemed too convenient. She asked carefully, Henry replied, quote 167, quote 168, quote 169. The use of her name startled him. She had told him her name the night before, but hearing him say it now in the context of this unexpected offer made it feel more personal, somehow. Quote 170, Janet said. Quote 171, Janet nodded, her mind racing. The practical part of her knew that this might be her best option, perhaps her only real option. But the part of her that had learned to be cautious around men was screaming warnings. What did she really know about Henry Garcia? What were his true motivations? What would happen if she accepted his offer and then discovered that his intentions were not as pure as they seemed? Quote, she asked. Quote, quote, Henry was quiet for so long that Janet wondered if he was going to answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful and measured. He said, Janet heard the old pain in his voice and remained silent, sensing that he needed to tell this story in his own way. Henry continued, quote, quote, Janet asked quietly. Quote, Henry said, quote, Janet began to understand why Henry had sought solitude in these mountains. A man caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, would find peace in a place where such distinctions mattered less. Quote, 185 to him, she said. Quote, 186 to him. Quote, 187, Henry considered this. Quote, 188, he admitted. Quote, 189. Janet understood that feeling all too well. Since her husband's death, she had often felt alone even when surrounded by others, isolated by her circumstances and her grief. What about you? Henry asked. What was your life like before you came west? Janet found herself wanting to tell him the truth, all of it, in a way she had not wanted to confide in anyone for a long time. My husband and I had a small farm in Kansas, she said. We were happy, or at least I thought we were. We were trying to have children, but it never happened. Then David was killed in a mining accident, and I discovered that we owed more money than the farm was worth. So you lost everything. Everything. I sold what I could and used the money to pay off the debts. There was nothing left. No family to turn to, no friends who could help. I had to find work, and there was not much available for a woman alone. What kind of work did you find? Janet hesitated. This was the part of her story that she was least proud of, the compromises she had been forced to make to survive. Whatever I could, she said finally, cooking, cleaning, sewing. I worked in a saloon for a while, serving drinks and food. Nothing improper, she added quickly, but the kind of work that respectable people look down on. There is no shame in honest work, Henry said firmly. You did what you had to do to survive. His matter-of-fact acceptance of her past surprised Janet. She had expected judgment, perhaps disgust at her association with the saloon. Instead, she heard only understanding and respect for the difficult choices she had been forced to make. The wagon train was supposed to be my chance for a fresh start, Janet continued. I had saved enough money to pay for passage to Denver, where I hoped to find better work, maybe even remarry eventually. And then you became sick. And then I became sick, and everything changed again. They sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Janet found herself thinking about the strange turns her life had taken, the way fate seemed to delight in destroying her plans and forcing her down unexpected paths. Henry, she said finally. Yes? If I stayed here, what would people think? A man and woman living together without being married, it would cause talk. What people? Henry asked. The nearest neighbor is 20 miles away. The nearest town is 50 miles. Who would know, and why would they care? Janet had not considered this. She had been thinking in terms of the social conventions she had known all her life, the complex web of proprieties and expectations that governed relationships between men and women. But those rules seemed less relevant in this isolated place where survival mattered more than reputation. It would still be improper, she said, though with less conviction than before. According to whose standards, Henry asked? The same people who left you to die in the wilderness because they were afraid of catching your fever? The question hit home. Why should she care about the opinions of people who had abandoned her when she needed help? Why should she follow the rules of a society that had offered her nothing but hardship and judgment? I suppose you are right, Janet said slowly. I'm not trying to convince you of anything, Henry said. I'm only pointing out that you have choices. You can live according to other people's rules, or you can live according to your own. It was a radical idea, the notion that she could choose her own path without regard for what others might think. Janet had never considered such a possibility. She had always been bound by the expectations of others, first her parents, then her husband, then the various employers and communities she had encountered since David's death. Quote 217, she asked, almost to herself. Quote 200, Henry replied. Quote 20. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of wind picking up outside, followed by what sounded like sleet hitting the windows. Henry got up, and Janet heard him moving to what must have been a window, he said. Janet felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. If she had still been wandering in the forest, this new storm would have killed her for certain. She asked. Henry replied, quote, too far. The implications of this hit Janet immediately. Even if she wanted to leave, she would not be able to do so until the storm passed. She was trapped here, dependent on Henry's hospitality whether she liked it or not. You are worried, Henry observed, returning to his seat by the fire. A little, Janet admitted. I do not like being trapped anywhere. You are not trapped, Henry said gently. You are safe. There is a difference. Janet tried to see it from his perspective, but the feeling of being confined, of having no control over her circumstances, was overwhelming. She had felt this way too many times in the past 2 years, dependent on the kindness of others, unable to make her own choices about her life and her future. I know you mean well, she said, but you must understand how difficult this is for me. I have been on my own for 2 years, making my own decisions, taking care of myself. Now I cannot even see where I am or find my way to the door. Your independence is important to you, Henry said, and it was not a question. It is all I have left, Janet replied. When David died, I lost everything else. My home, my security, my plans for the future. The only thing I managed to keep was my ability to take care of myself. Now I have lost that too. Henry was quiet for a moment, considering her words. You have not lost your independence, he said finally. You have lost your sight. Those are not the same thing. How can you say that? I cannot even walk across a room without help. Because you have not learned how yet, Henry replied. But you can learn. People who are born blind manage to live independent lives. There is no reason you cannot do the same. Janet wanted to argue with him, to point out all the ways that blindness limited her options and made her dependent on others. But something in his tone suggested that he was speaking from knowledge rather than mere optimism. Do you know someone who is blind? She asked. I knew a man in the army, Henry said. He lost his sight in a battle with the Apaches. At first, he was convinced his life was over. He wanted to die rather than live as what he called a useless burden. What happened to him? He learned to live differently. It took time, and it was not easy, but he learned to navigate by sound and touch, to recognize people by their voices, to do most of the things he had done before. By the time I left the army, he was training other soldiers in tracking and reconnaissance. His other senses had become so sharp that he could hear and smell things the rest of us missed. The story gave Janet a spark of hope, though she tried not to let it grow too large. That was a man, she pointed out. Men have more opportunities, more options. True, Henry agreed, but the basic principle is the same. You can learn to live without sight. It will be different from the life you planned, but it does not have to be a lesser life. Janet wanted to believe him, but the obstacles seemed insurmountable. How could a blind woman support herself? What kind of work could she do? Where could she live safely? Even if I could learn to manage on my own, she said, what then? Where would I go? What would I do? Those are questions for later, Henry said. Right now, the important thing is to learn what you can do, not to worry about what you cannot. And you would teach me? If you want me to, yes. The offer was generous beyond measure, and Janet found herself struggling with emotions she could not quite name. Gratitude, certainly, but also fear and something that might have been hope. Why, she asked, why would you do that for me? Henry was quiet for a long time, and when he spoke, his voice was softer than she had heard it before. Because everyone deserves a chance to live with dignity, he said. Because you remind me that there is still good in the world worth protecting. And because I think we might be able to help each other. Help each other how? You said yourself that loneliness is hard to bear. I have been alone in these mountains for 5 years. Perhaps it is time I remembered what it is like to have someone to talk to cook for, to care about. The honesty of his answer moved Janet more than any elaborate declaration could have. He was not offering charity or pity, but partnership. The idea that she might have something to offer him, even in her current state, was almost revolutionary. I would not want you to help me out of loneliness, she said. That would not be fair to either of us. It would not be only loneliness, Henry replied. I meant what I said about needing help with the house. And there are other things, practical things, that would be easier with two people, such as preserving food for the winter, tending the garden in the spring, keeping watch when storms threaten. A dozen small tasks that are manageable for one person but easier for two. Janet could hear the practicality in his voice, the careful reasoning that suggested he had thought this through thoroughly. It was not a romantic gesture or an impulsive offer of charity, but a sensible arrangement that would benefit them both. And if it does not work out, she asked, if we find we cannot live together peacefully, then we will find another solution, Henry said simply. But I think we are both reasonable people. I think we can make it work if we both want to. The storm outside was growing stronger, and Janet could hear tree branches scraping against the roof. The sound reminded her of how precarious her situation had been just hours ago, how close she had come to dying alone in the wilderness. All right, she said quietly. All right, I will try it. I will stay here and see if we can make this arrangement work. She heard Henry let out a breath, as if he had been holding it while waiting for her answer. Good, he said. I am glad. But I have conditions, Janet added quickly. Of course, what are they? First, I want to learn to take care of myself as much as possible. I do not want to be helpless or dependent. Agreed. Second, if either of us decides this is not working, we will discuss it honestly and find a solution that is fair to both of us. Agreed. And third, Janet hesitated, then forced herself to continue. I want your word that you will not take advantage of my situation. I am vulnerable right now, and I need to know that I can trust you to behave honorably. You have my word, Henry said solemnly. I will never do anything to harm you or take advantage of you in any way. The sincerity in his voice convinced her more than any oath could have. Janet nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension about the path she had chosen. Then we have an agreement, she said. We have an agreement, Henry confirmed. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, Janet felt something she had not experienced in a very long time. Not just safety or warmth, but the possibility of a future that might be different from anything she had imagined, but no less valuable for being unexpected. The wind howled around the cabin like a living thing, seeking entry through every crack and crevice, but the solid walls held firm against its assault. Janet sat by the fire, listening to the storm and trying to process the magnitude of the decision she had just made. She was going to stay here in this remote cabin with a man she barely knew and try to build some kind of life from the ruins of her old one. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. The storm will get worse before it gets better, Henry said, returning from what sounded like a tour of the windows and doors. But we are well prepared. There is plenty of firewood, enough food to last for weeks if necessary, and the cabin is solid. You sound like you have weathered many storms here, Janet observed. More than I can count, Henry replied. The first winter was the hardest. I was still learning the rhythms of this place, still making mistakes that could have cost me my life. But the mountains teach you quickly, if you are willing to learn. What kind of mistakes? Not cutting enough firewood, not preserving enough food, underestimating how quickly the weather can change. Henry paused, not understanding how the isolation can affect your mind. Janet heard something in his voice that made her pay closer attention. What do you mean? The first winter, I went nearly 4 months without seeing another human being, Henry said. By the end of it, I was talking to myself constantly, just to hear a human voice. I started to understand why some men go mad in places like this. The admission surprised Janet. Henry seemed so steady, so self-contained, that she had not imagined him struggling with loneliness or doubt. But you stayed, she said. I stayed. I learned to manage the isolation, to find peace in the solitude instead of fighting it. but it was not easy. Janet wondered if this was part of why he had offered to let her stay. Not just kindness or practical necessity, but a recognition of his own need for human companionship. "Do you think I will go mad?" she asked, half joking. "I think you are stronger than you know," Henry replied seriously. "You have already survived things that would have broken many people. A woman who can do that can survive anything." His confidence in her was both comforting and daunting. Janet did not feel strong. She felt lost and frightened and overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control. But perhaps strength was not about feeling brave. Perhaps it was about continuing to move forward, even when you were afraid. "Will you teach me about this place?" she asked. "About how to live here, how to survive in the mountains?" "If you want to learn, yes," Henry said. "But we will start slowly. First, you need to learn your way around the cabin to move safely in the space where you will be living." "All right, where do we begin?" Henry stood up, and Janet heard his footsteps moving around the room. "We begin with mapping the space in your mind," he said. "Every room, every piece of furniture, every potential hazard. You need to know this place so well that you can navigate it in complete darkness." "I am already in complete darkness," Janet pointed out. "True, but most people rely so heavily on sight that they never develop their other senses fully. You will learn to see with your hands and ears and nose to build a picture of the world that is just as accurate as vision, sometimes more so." The idea seemed impossible, but Janet was willing to try. What choice did she have? "Stand up," Henry said. "We will start with this room." Janet rose from her chair and immediately felt disoriented. Without the familiar reference point of sitting by the fire, she had no idea which direction she was facing or where anything else in the room might be. "Take my arm," Henry said, moving to stand beside her. "We will walk the perimeter of the room first, so you can understand its size and shape." Janet took his offered arm and let him guide her slowly around the edges of the main room. He stopped frequently to let her feel the walls, to identify windows and doors, to count steps between landmarks. "The fireplace is on the north wall," Henry explained as they paused in front of the hearth. "The front door is on the south wall, directly across from the fireplace. The kitchen is in the southwest corner, and the hallway to the bedroom is in the southeast corner." Janet tried to fix these relationships in her mind, to build a mental map of the space. It was harder than she had expected. Without visual references, everything seemed to blur together. "This will take time," Henry said as if reading her thoughts. "Do not expect to master it immediately, but each day it will become a little easier." They spent the next hour exploring the cabin room by room. Henry showed her where everything was kept, from dishes in the kitchen to blankets in the bedroom, and made her practice finding things by touch alone. It was frustrating work. More than once, Janet knocked over a cup or bumped into a piece of furniture, and each mistake felt like evidence of her helplessness. "Enough for now," Henry said when he noticed her growing agitation. "You are trying too hard. This is not something you can force." Janet sank back into her chair by the fire, exhausted and discouraged. "I will never be able to do this," she said. "I will always be stumbling around like a blind fool." "You are not a fool, Henry said firmly. "You are a woman learning to live with a new reality. It is hard work, and it takes patience, Mom." "I am not a patient person," Janet admitted. "Then you will learn patience along with everything else," Henry replied. "The mountains teach that lesson to everyone who lives here." The storm continued to rage outside, and as the day wore on, Janet began to understand what Henry had meant about the isolation affecting one's mind. The constant sound of wind and sleet created a feeling of being under siege, cut off from the rest of the world. She found herself listening intently to every creak and groan of the cabin, every shift in the rhythm of the storm. "Tip rounds," she asked during a particularly violent gust that made the whole structure shudder. "Good as 3 and Henry assured her. "Good as 30. His confidence was reassuring, but Janet still felt vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with the structural integrity of the building. She was trapped here with a man she barely knew, completely dependent on his goodwill and protection. If he chose to harm her, there would be nothing she could do to stop him and nowhere she could run. The thought made her realize how much trust she was placing in Henry Garcia, and how little she really knew about him to justify that trust. He had been kind to her so far, but kindness could be a mask for darker intentions. She had heard too many stories of women who had trusted the wrong man and paid with their lives. Quote, she said carefully. Quote to three. Quote to three. Quote to three. Janet appreciated his honesty. Quote 37. Henry was quiet for a long moment. Quote, "Ferretin," he said finally. Quote, "Deartin." Quote, "Fern." Another brief pause. Quote, "31." The simple words carried a weight of grief that made Janet's chest tighten with sympathy. "I'm sorry," she said. "How long ago?" 7 years, Henry replied, "just before I came to the mountains." Janet began to understand another piece of Henry's story. He had not just been seeking solitude when he came here. He had been running from grief, from memories too painful to bear, in the places where they had been made. Quote 346, Janet asked softly. Quote 347, Henry said, and his voice was barely audible over the storm. Quote 348. They sat in silence for a while, both lost in memories of the people they had loved and lost. Janet found herself thinking about David, about the plans they had made, and the future they had dreamed of together. It seemed like a lifetime ago, though it had been only 2 years. She asked, Henry said. It was the most honest answer anyone had ever given her about grief. Most people tried to offer false comfort, assurances that time would heal all wounds and that she would eventually move on. Henry offered no such platitudes, only the truth as he had lived it. Quote 353, Janet asked. Henry considered this question seriously. Quote 354, he said finally. Quote 350, quote 356, quote 357. There was such pain in Henry's voice that Janet wished she could see his face, could offer some gesture of comfort. Instead, she had to rely on words alone. What happened? She asked gently. Henry was quiet for so long that Janet thought he was not going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat and emotionless, as if he were reciting facts rather than reliving memories. There was trouble with bandits in the area where we lived, he said. They had been raiding ranches and settlements, stealing cattle and horses, sometimes killing anyone who tried to stop them. Maria wanted us to leave, to go somewhere safer, but I refused. Why? Pride, stubbornness. I had built our ranch with my own hands, and I was not going to be driven away by a handful of outlaws. I thought I could protect what was mine. Janet could hear the self-recrimination in his voice, the weight of a decision that had cost him everything. They came at night, Henry continued. I was in town buying supplies. Maria was alone at the ranch. When I came home, I found... He stopped, unable to continue. I am so sorry, Janet whispered. I tracked them down, Henry said, his voice turning cold. All of them. It took me 3 months, but I found every man who had been there that night. Janet shivered at the tone of his voice. She did not need to ask what had happened when Henry found the men responsible for his wife's death. The answer was written in the careful way he spoke about it, in the deliberate absence of detail. Quote 368, she asked. Quote to 369. Janet understood now why Henry had sought isolation in these remote mountains. He was not just a man who preferred solitude. He was a man haunted by loss and guilt, seeking peace in a place where the past could not follow him. She asked, Henry said, quote 373. The storm outside was beginning to weaken, the wind dying down from a howl to a moan. But inside the cabin, the atmosphere remained heavy with the weight of shared confessions. Quote 37, Janet said, quote 37, quote 376. Henry replied, quote 377. Janet considered this. Henry was right that she should know the truth about the man she was placing her trust in, but what she had heard did not make her want to leave. If anything, it made her trust him more. A man who had loved his wife enough to avenge her death, who carried that guilt and grief with such dignity, was not likely to harm another woman placed in his care. Quote 378, Janet said finally. Quote 379. She heard Henry draw in a sharp breath, as if her words had hit him unexpectedly hard. Quote 380, he said quietly. Quote 381. The storm continued to weaken as the afternoon wore on, and by evening it had settled into a steady but manageable snowfall. Henry prepared another simple but satisfying dinner, and they ate by the fire as the cabin settled around them. Henry said as they finished their meal, Quote three, quote on to Janet asked. Quote to quote fun, Henry replied. Quote to the idea of being able to go outside alone, to have even that small measure of independence was appealing. Janet had been feeling claustrophobic in the cabin, despite its comfortable size. The knowledge that she was essentially trapped inside had been weighing on her mind. Quote 388, she said. Quote 389. Janet tried to picture the layout Henry was describing to add these outdoor features to the mental map she was building. It was encouraging to think that someday she might be able to navigate this place independently, to contribute meaningfully to the work that needed to be done. She said as they prepared for bed, Henry replied, quote 394. As Janet settled into bed for her second night in the cabin, she reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. A week ago, she had been a passenger on a wagon train, heading toward an uncertain future in Denver. Now she was living in a remote mountain cabin with a man she was only beginning to know, preparing to learn skills she had never imagined needing. It was not the life she had planned. But it was not without hope. Henry Garcia was a good man. She was increasingly certain of that. And if she could learn to live independently despite her blindness, perhaps she could build something meaningful from the wreckage of her old life. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. For the first time since the fever had taken her sight, Janet allowed herself to imagine a future that might be different from her past, but no less valuable. It would require courage and patience and hard work, but she was beginning to believe that she might be capable of more than she had thought possible. Outside, the storm was finally dying away, leaving behind a silence that felt pregnant with possibility. Janet closed her eyes, though the gesture was purely symbolic in her world of perpetual darkness, and let herself drift towards sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new lessons, but tonight she was warm and safe and no longer alone. For now, that was enough. The morning brought a crystalline silence that seemed to ring in Janet's ears after the chaos of the storm. She woke to the sound of Henry moving quietly around the cabin, banking the fire and preparing what smelled like coffee and bacon. "Good morning," she called softly. "Good morning," Henry replied. "The storm has passed. It will be a good day to begin your education about the outdoors." Janet dressed quickly and joined him in the main room. The coffee was strong and hot, exactly what she needed to clear the fog of sleep from her mind. "How much snow did we get?" she asked. "About 2 feet," Henry said. "Not unusual for this time of year, but enough to make travel difficult for anyone not prepared for it." Janet thought about what would have happened if she had still been wandering in the forest when this storm hit. She would have died within hours, buried under snow and ice with no one to mark her passing. "I owe you my life," she said quietly. "You owe me nothing," Henry replied firmly. "Helping someone in need is not a debt to be repaid. It is simply what decent people do." After breakfast, Henry helped Janet into her coat and boots, then guided her to the front door of the cabin. "Are you ready for your first lesson in winter survival?" he asked. "As ready as I will ever be," Janet replied, though her heart was racing with nervousness. Henry opened the door, and Janet felt a rush of cold air that made her gasp. But underneath the chill, she could smell something clean and pure, the scent of fresh snow and pine trees. "Live carefully," Henry warned as he guided her onto what must have been the front porch. "The steps are covered with snow, and they may be slippery." Janet felt her way down the steps with Henry's help, her boots crunching in the snow. The sound was different from anything she had experienced before, muffled and crisp at the same time. Henry said, he was right. Janet's first few steps were clumsy and exhausting, her boots catching in the snow and nearly tripping her. But Henry's steady hand on her arm kept her upright, and gradually she began to find a rhythm. Henry said, stopping suddenly. Janet stood still and concentrated on the sounds around her. At first, all she could hear was the whisper of wind through the trees, and the distant drip of melting snow. But as she listened more carefully, she began to pick out other sounds. The crack of a branch settling under the weight of snow, the rustle of some small animal moving through the underbrush, the distant call of a bird she could not identify. Henry said, they spent the next hour exploring the immediate area around the cabin. Henry showed her the well he had mentioned, a stone-lined circle that she could identify by the sound of her footsteps echoing differently when she stood near it. He guided her to the woodshed, a solid structure that smelled of pine sap and seasoned timber. Henry advised. Janet tried to memorize the distances, but it was harder than she had expected. Without visual landmarks, everything seemed to blur together in her mind. Henry said, noticing her frustration. They returned to the cabin for lunch, and Janet was surprised by how tired she felt. The simple act of walking through snow while concentrating intensely on sounds and distances had been more exhausting than a full day of physical labor. Quote 47, Henry said as they ate. Quote fraud. Janet appreciated his understanding that she needed to feel like she was contributing rather than just being cared for. The sense of helplessness that had been weighing on her since losing her sight was gradually being replaced by a cautious optimism that she might be able to learn to manage on her own. "Che," she asked. Henry said. They spent the afternoon in the kitchen area of the cabin, with Henry patiently teaching Janet where everything was kept and how to prepare simple meals without being able to see what she was doing. It was frustrating work. More than once, she cut herself with a knife or burned her fingers on a hot pan. But gradually, she began to develop a sense of how to work by touch and sound alone. Quote 422. Henry observed as Janet successfully prepared a simple stew under his guidance. Quote 423. Quote 424, Janet replied. Quote 424. As evening approached, they sat by the fire again, and Janet found herself reflecting on how much had changed in just a few days. She was beginning to feel less like a helpless victim and more like a person adapting to new circumstances. It was a small shift, but it felt significant. Quote 426, she said as they prepared for bed. Quote 427, Sean. Quote 428. Henry considered the question seriously. Quote 429, he said. Quote 430. It was an encouraging answer, though Janet knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. But for the first time since losing her sight, she was beginning to believe that there might be a future worth working toward. As she lay in bed that night, listening to the settling sounds of the cabin and the distant whisper of wind through the trees, Janet allowed herself to imagine what that future might look like. Perhaps she would stay here with Henry, building a life of quiet partnership in these remote mountains. Perhaps she would eventually learn enough to strike out on her own, finding work and independence in some distant town. Either way, she was no longer the helpless woman who had been stumbling through the forest just days ago. She was learning to see the world in new ways, to navigate by sound and touch and instinct. It would take time and patience and countless small failures, but she was beginning to believe that she could do it. The knowledge filled her with a cautious hope that felt almost foreign after so many months of despair and uncertainty. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, she would face them with growing confidence in her own abilities and the steady support of a man who believed in her potential, even when she struggled to believe in it herself. For now, that was more than enough. It was the foundation on which she could begin to build a new life, different from anything she had imagined, but no less valuable for being unexpected. The sound that woke Janet was subtle but wrong, a soft scraping against the outer wall of the cabin that did not belong to the normal symphony of mountain sounds she was learning to recognize. She lay still in the darkness, listening intently, trying to determine if she had imagined it or if something was actually moving around outside. There it was again, deliberate, careful, the sound of something large trying to move quietly through the snow. Janet's heart began to race as she realized this was not the random wandering of a wild animal. Whatever was out there was being cautious, purposeful, as if it did not want to be detected. She heard Henry moving in the main room, his footsteps careful but urgent. A moment later, his voice came softly through the bedroom door. "Janet, wake up, but do not make any noise." "I am awake," she whispered back. "I heard it too." "Get dressed quickly and quietly," Henry said, his voice barely audible. "We may need to leave the cabin." Janet's blood turned to ice. Leave the cabin? In the middle of the night? In deep snow, with her unable to see where she was going? The thought was terrifying beyond measure. She dressed as quickly and quietly as she could, her hands shaking as she pulled on her boots and coat. Through the thin walls of the cabin, she could hear more sounds now. Multiple sets of footsteps moving around the building, the low murmur of voices speaking in what sounded like a foreign language. Henry appeared in the bedroom doorway, moving so quietly she would not have known he was there if he had not spoken. Quote 436, he whispered. Quote 437. Quote 438. Janet asked, though she was not sure she wanted to know the answer. Henry replied grimly. Janet felt panic rising in her throat. She was trapped in a remote cabin with armed men outside, and she could not even see to defend herself or find her way to safety. She whispered, quote 442. Henry said, quote 40. Quote 4. Janet protested. Quote 4. Quote 46. Henry said firmly, quote 47. Before Janet could respond, the sounds outside changed. The careful stealth was abandoned and replaced by the deliberate noise of men who no longer cared about being detected. Heavy boots stomped up the front steps and a fist pounded against the door. Quote 40, a rough voice shouted. Quote 40. Henry cursed softly in Spanish. Quote Barn, he said. Quote Vages. The pounding on the door intensified, accompanied by more shouting. Janet could make out at least two different voices, both speaking English with accents she could not place. She whispered. Henry replied. The pounding stopped suddenly, replaced by a more ominous sound, the scrape of metal against wood, as if someone was working on the lock or trying to force the door. Henry ordered quietly. Janet crawled behind the bed as instructed, her heart hammering so hard she was sure the men outside must be able to hear it. She heard Henry moving around the room, the soft sound of metal sliding against leather that suggested he was checking his weapons. A moment later, the front door crashed open with a splintering of wood. Heavy footsteps stomped into the cabin, accompanied by harsh voices and the sound of furniture being overturned. Quote 457, one of the intruders commanded. Quote 458. Janet's blood froze. They were looking for her specifically, not just robbing a random cabin, but how could they know she was here? And what did they want with her? The footsteps moved through the main room, getting closer to the bedroom. Janet pressed herself against the floor behind the bed, trying to make herself as small as possible. Henry Garcia, the leader called out. We know you are here, and we know you have the woman. Come out now, and maybe we can work something out. Henry's voice came from somewhere near the bedroom door, calm and steady despite the circumstances. Quote 461, quote, the leader replied. Quote, Borschen, quote, Varum, Henry asked. Quote, Varum, a harsh laugh echoed through the cabin. Quote 466, Janet's mind raced. How could they have tracked her? She had been unconscious during the storm, and Henry had said the snow would have covered any tracks. Unless, who sent you, Henry asked, and Janet could hear the tension in his voice. Someone who wants his property back, the leader replied. The woman owes a debt, and we are here to collect. Janet's stomach dropped as understanding dawned. Kevin Rodriguez, the man who owned the saloon where she had worked, who had been pressuring her to accept his increasingly inappropriate advances. When she had refused and left his employment, he had accused her of stealing money from the till. She had denied it, and there had been no proof, but Rodriguez had sworn he would find her and make her pay. Somehow, he had tracked her to the wagon train, and when the train had abandoned her, his men had followed her trail to Henry's cabin. I do not know what debt you are talking about, Henry said, but there is no woman here. Then you will not mind if we search the place, the leader said, and Janet heard footsteps moving toward the bedroom. She pressed herself harder against the floor, knowing that discovery was inevitable, but hoping against hope that somehow she might remain hidden. The footsteps entered the bedroom, and she heard the sound of the wardrobe being opened, blankets being thrown aside. Found her, a different voice said, and Janet felt rough hands grab her arms and haul her to her feet. No! Henry's voice was sharp with anger and alarm. Get out time, the leader said. Quote Fox, Janet was dragged out into the main room, stumbling and disoriented. She could smell unwashed bodies and cheap whiskey, could hear the heavy breathing of at least 3 men surrounding her. Quote 477. Henry said, and his voice carried a deadly calm that made Janet's skin crawl. She has done nothing wrong. That is not for you to decide, the leader replied. She stole from Mr. Rodriguez, and now she has to pay the price. I did not steal anything, Janet said, finding her voice despite her terror. Rodriguez is lying. That is what they all say, one of the other men said with a laugh. But Mr. Rodriguez says different, and his word is good enough for us. Janet felt the man holding her arms tighten his grip, and she winced in pain. "You are hurting me," she said. "You ain't seen hurt yet," the man replied. "Not until we get you back to Mr. Rodriguez." "She is not going anywhere with you," Henry said, and Janet heard the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly, tension crackling like electricity before a storm. Janet heard the rustle of clothing as the other men reached for their own weapons. "Now, Garcia," the leader said, his voice taking on a warning tone, "let us not do anything stupid. You are outnumbered here." "Maybe," Henry replied, "but the first man who tries to take her out of this cabin will be the first to die." Janet stood frozen between the two sides, feeling like a rope in a deadly game of tug-of-war. She could not see what was happening, but she could sense the violence hanging in the air like a physical presence. "She is not worth dying for," the leader said, trying a different approach. "You barely know this woman. Why risk your life for someone who means nothing to you?" "That is where you are wrong," Henry said quietly. "She means everything to me." The words hit Janet like a physical blow. In the midst of this terrifying confrontation, Henry had just declared something that changed everything between them. She felt tears spring to her eyes, though whether from fear, gratitude, or something else entirely, she could not say. "How touching," the leader said mockingly. "But it does not change anything. We have our orders, and we are not leaving without her." "Then you are not leaving at all," Henry replied, and Janet heard the finality in his voice. The silence stretched out like a taut wire ready to snap at any moment. Janet could feel the men around her shifting nervously, could sense their uncertainty about how to proceed. They had expected to find a helpless woman and perhaps intimidate a lone mountain man into compliance. Instead, they had walked into a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond their control. "Last chance, Garcia," the leader said. "Hand over the woman, or we take her by force." "Come and try," Henry replied. The explosion of violence was sudden and terrifying. Janet heard gunshots, shouts, the crash of bodies hitting furniture. The man holding her arms released her suddenly, and she fell to the floor, crawling frantically toward what she hoped was safety. The sounds of the fight seemed to go on forever, though it was probably only seconds. More gunshots, the sound of breaking glass, a scream of pain that was abruptly cut off. Then suddenly silence. "Janet," Henry's voice called softly. She replied, her voice shaking. Henry said, "Quote 507. Janet heard him moving around the cabin, the sound of his footsteps careful and deliberate. She smelled gunpowder and something else, something metallic and unpleasant that she did not want to think about too closely. "Quote 508. Henry said finally. "Quote 509. Janet rose shakily to her feet, her legs barely able to support her weight. "Quote 5. Quote fun," Henry said simply. "Quote fun." The blunt statement hit Janet with unexpected force. 3 men had died in this room, men who had come here to take her away, to drag her back to face whatever punishment Kevin Rodriguez had planned for her. The knowledge that she was safe was overwhelming, but it came with a cost that made her feel sick. She whispered. Henry asked, moving to stand beside her. Quote 550. Henry's hand touched her shoulder gently. "You did not cause any of this," he said firmly. "Those men chose to come here with violence in their hearts. They chose to threaten an innocent woman. What happened to them was the consequence of their own actions." Janet wanted to believe him, but the guilt was crushing. If she had not been here, if she had died in the forest as she was supposed to, none of this would have happened. "What do we do now?" she asked. "Now we clean up this mess," Henry said grimly. "And then we decide what to do about Kevin Rodriguez." The way he said Rodriguez's name made Janet shiver. There was something cold and implacable in Henry's voice, something that reminded her of his story about hunting down the men who had killed his wife. "You cannot go after Rodriguez," she said quickly. "It would be too dangerous. He has more men, more resources." "Perhaps," Henry said, "but he made a mistake when he sent those men here. He declared war on me, and he threatened someone under my protection. That cannot go unanswered." Janet felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold mountain air. She was beginning to understand that there were depths to Henry Garcia that she had not suspected, a capacity for violence that he kept carefully controlled, but that could be unleashed when circumstances demanded it. The men who had come for her tonight had made the fatal error of assuming they were dealing with an ordinary mountain hermit. Instead, they had encountered a man with a soldier's training and a killer's instincts, someone who would not hesitate to use deadly force to protect what he considered his own. And somewhere in the midst of this terrifying night, Janet had become his own. The declaration he had made during the confrontation echoed in her mind, changing everything she thought she knew about their relationship. But first, they had to deal with the immediate aftermath of the violence that had shattered the peace of their mountain refuge. And then, whether she wanted it or not, Janet was going to have to face the reality that Kevin Rodriguez would not give up easily, and that her presence here had put both her and Henry in mortal danger. The war for her freedom had only just begun. The metallic smell of blood hung thick in the cabin air as Henry moved methodically through the aftermath of violence. Janet remained pressed against the wall where she had taken shelter, her hands trembling as she listened to the sounds of Henry dragging heavy objects across the wooden floor. Each scrape and thud made her stomach clench tighter, knowing that those sounds represented the bodies of men who had died because of her. "Henry," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind that had picked up outside again. "I am here," he replied, his voice coming from near the front door. "I am just moving them outside. The cold will preserve them until we can decide what to do." Janet tried not to think about what that meant, about the grim practicalities of dealing with 3 dead men in a remote mountain cabin. She had never been so close to violence before, had never imagined that death could arrive so suddenly and brutally. "Are you hurt?" she asked, the question she should have asked first now finally making its way past her shock. "A few cuts and bruises, nothing serious," Henry said. They were not expecting much resistance from a mountain hermit. There was something cold in his voice that Janet had never heard before, a detachment that spoke of a man who had dealt with violence many times in his past. She remembered his story about hunting down the men who had killed his wife, and she began to understand that the gentle, patient man who had been teaching her to navigate her blindness was only one facet of Henry Garcia. The sounds of cleanup continued for what felt like hours. Henry worked in silence, methodically restoring order to the cabin that had been turned into a battlefield. Janet heard him sweeping up broken glass, righting overturned furniture, scrubbing what she assumed were bloodstains from the wooden floor. When he finally finished, the cabin felt different somehow. The violence that had erupted here had changed the very atmosphere of the place, stealing some of the peace and safety that Janet had begun to associate with these walls. "It is done," Henry said, settling into his chair by the fire. "But we need to talk about what happens next." Janet made her way carefully to her own chair, using the mental map she had been building to navigate the familiar space. Even in the darkness of her blindness, she could sense that things had been moved, that the careful order of the room had been disrupted. "Rodriguez will send more men," she said, voicing the fear that had been growing in her mind since the moment she had heard the leader mention his name. "Yes," Henry agreed. "When these 3 do not return, he will know that something went wrong. He will send more men, better armed and more prepared for resistance." "Then I have to leave," Janet said, though the words felt like stones in her mouth. "I have to go somewhere he cannot find me." "Where?" Henry asked quietly. "You have no money, no family, no friends who could hide you, and you cannot see to travel safely on your own." The brutal honesty of his assessment hit Janet like a physical blow. He was right, of course. She had nowhere to go and no means of getting there. Her blindness made her completely dependent on others for survival, and there were few people in the world who would be willing to risk their lives to protect a woman they barely knew. "Then what do you suggest?" she asked, though she was not sure she wanted to hear the answer. Henry was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made Janet's heart race. Quote 541, he said simply, and quote 542, quote 543. Janet shivered at the calm way Henry discussed violence, as if it were just another practical problem to be solved. But she was beginning to understand that for a man like Henry Garcia, violence was indeed a tool to be used when other options had been exhausted. Quote 544, Janet said. Quote 545, quote 546, Henry said. Quote 547. The finality in Henry's voice told Janet that he had already made his decision. She felt a crushing weight of guilt settle over her shoulders. This man who had saved her life, who had shown her kindness and patience beyond measure, was now preparing to risk everything to protect her from the consequences of her own past. "There has to be another way," she said desperately. "If there is, I cannot see it," Henry replied. "Rodriguez is not the kind of man who can be reasoned with or bought off. He sees you as his property, and he will not stop until he reclaims what he thinks belongs to him." Janet felt tears burning behind her sightless eyes. The injustice of it all was overwhelming. She had done nothing wrong, had committed no crime, except refusing the advances of a powerful man who was used to getting what he wanted. Now good people were dying because of her, and more would die before this was over. "I should have let them take me," she whispered. "No," Henry said firmly, and she heard his chair creak as he leaned forward. "Do not ever think that. You did nothing to deserve what Rodriguez wants to do to you. The fault lies with him and the men who choose to follow his orders. But if I had gone with them, you would be safe. You could go back to your quiet life in the mountains." "My quiet life ended the moment I found you in that forest," Henry said, and there was something in his voice that made Janet's breath catch. "Or five The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Janet was afraid to examine too closely. She had heard the declaration he had made during the fight, the claim that she meant everything to him. But in the heat of the moment, she had assumed it was just something said to protect her, not a genuine expression of his feelings. Now, in the quiet aftermath of violence, those words seemed to carry more weight. She began, but he cut her off. He said, his voice returning to its usual calm tone. Quote 559, Janet wanted to press him about what he had said, wanted to understand what was happening between them. But she could hear the exhaustion in his voice, could sense that he needed time to process the events of the night just as much as she did. Quote 560, she asked. Quote 561, Henry said. Quote 562. Janet nodded and made her way back to the bedroom, though she doubted she would be able to sleep. Her mind was racing with questions and fears, with the memory of gunshots and the knowledge that 3 men lay dead outside because of her. But as she settled under the quilts, she heard Henry moving around the main room, checking the doors and windows, banking the fire for the night. The familiar domestic sounds were comforting, a reminder that despite everything that had happened, she was still safe in this place with this man who had risked his life to protect her. Sleep came eventually, though it was filled with nightmares of faceless men pursuing her through endless forests, of gunshots and screams echoing off mountain walls. She woke several times during the night, disoriented and afraid, but each time she heard Henry's steady breathing from the main room and was able to drift back into uneasy slumber. Morning brought no relief from the tension that had settled over the cabin like a heavy blanket. Janet woke to the sound of Henry moving around outside, and when she emerged from the bedroom, she found him cleaning his weapons at the kitchen table. "Good morning," she said quietly. "Morning," Henry replied, not looking up from the rifle he was examining. "There is coffee on the stove, and I made some biscuits." Janet poured herself coffee and sat down across from him, listening to the methodical sounds of him checking each weapon thoroughly. The routine was both comforting and ominous, a reminder that they were preparing for war. "How many guns do you have?" she asked. "Enough," Henry said simply. "Rifles, pistols, shotguns. Living alone in the mountains, a man learns to be prepared for trouble. Do you think it will be enough against Rodriguez and his men?" Henry paused in his work and looked up at her, though she could not see his expression. "Numbers are not everything in a fight, boss," he said. "Training, preparation, and knowing the terrain can overcome superior numbers. I have advantages that Rodriguez does not." "Such as?" "I know these mountains better than anyone. I know places to hide, places to make a stand, places where a few men can hold off many. And I have something Rodriguez does not." "What is that?" "A reason to fight that goes beyond money or power." The simple statement carried a weight that made Janet's heart clench. Henry was willing to risk everything for her, and she still did not fully understand why. They had known each other for less than a week, had shared nothing more than conversation and the basic human kindness of helping someone in need. Yet somehow, in that brief time, she had become important enough to him that he was prepared to go to war against a man like Kevin Rodriguez. Quote 576 or so, she said carefully, quote 577. Henry's hand stilled on the rifle, and the silence stretched out between them like a taut wire. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. I meant every word. Janet felt her breath catch in her throat. But how is that possible? We barely know each other. I know enough, Henry said. I know that you are brave and strong, even when you do not feel that way. I know that you have survived things that would have broken most people. I know that you have brought something into my life that I thought I had lost forever. What is that? Purpose, hope, the feeling that there is something in this world worth protecting. The words hit Janet like a physical blow, stirring emotions she had thought buried with her husband. She had not expected to feel anything like this again, had assumed that part of her life was over when David died. I do not know what to say, she whispered. You do not have to say anything, Henry replied. I am not asking for anything from you, Janet. I am just telling you the truth about how I feel. Janet sat in stunned silence, trying to process what Henry had just revealed. The idea that this strong, capable man could have developed such deep feelings for her so quickly seemed impossible. Yet she could hear the sincerity in his voice, could sense the vulnerability behind his careful words. What about Maria? She asked quietly. Your wife. Do you not feel like you are betraying her memory? Henry was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. I loved Maria with everything I had, he said. Her death nearly destroyed me. For years, I thought I would never feel anything like that again. Never want to. He paused, and Janet heard him set down the rifle. But Maria would not want me to spend the rest of my life alone mourning what we lost. She would want me to find happiness again, to protect someone who needed protecting. She would understand. Janet felt tears sliding down her cheeks, though she could not say whether they were tears of sadness or something else entirely. The depth of Henry's feelings, the way he had opened his heart to her despite the pain of his past, was overwhelming. She admitted, quote 593, quote 594, Henry's chair scraped against the floor, and she felt him move to sit beside her. His hand found hers, warm and calloused and gentle. You are worthy of any man's love, he said firmly. And as for the rest, fear is natural, but it is not a reason to turn away from something good. Janet squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his steady presence. What if we do not survive what is coming? What if Rodriguez kills us both? Then at least we will have had this, Henry said. This moment, this connection, this feeling of being alive and caring about someone. That is more than many people ever have. The simple truth of his words cut through Janet's fears and doubts like a knife. She had spent so much time since David's death just trying to survive, just trying to get through each day, that she had forgotten what it felt like to truly live. I care about you too, she said quietly, more than I thought possible. She felt Henry's hand tighten on hers, and when he spoke, she could hear the smile in his voice. He said simply. They sat together in the morning light, hands clasped, both understanding that they had crossed some invisible line that changed everything between them. The danger that surrounded them had not diminished, but somehow it seemed less overwhelming now that they were facing it together. Janet asked, quote 604 by, Henry said, returning to his practical tone. Quote 600 pound, quote 606, or quote 607. Janet heard the cold determination in his voice and shivered. The gentle man who had just declared his feelings for her was also a killer, someone who could end lives without hesitation when circumstances demanded it. The duality was both frightening and oddly comforting. She asked, Henry said. The idea of holding a weapon, of potentially taking a life, made Janet's stomach turn. But she knew Henry was right. If Rodriguez's men broke through whatever defenses Henry could mount, she would need some way to protect herself. She said. Henry spent the rest of the morning showing Janet how to load and fire a pistol, how to feel when it was ready to shoot, how to hold it steady despite her trembling hands. It was difficult work, made harder by her inability to see what she was doing, but gradually she began to develop a sense of the weapon's weight and balance. The most important thing is not to panic, Henry said as they practiced in the area behind the cabin. If someone is close enough for you to hit them, they are close enough to be dangerous. You will only get one chance, so make it count. Janet nodded, though her hands shook every time she pulled the trigger. The idea that she might actually have to use this knowledge, that she might have to take a human life to save her own, was almost too much to bear. But as the day wore on and Henry continued his preparations, checking and rechecking their defenses, cleaning weapons, and counting ammunition, Janet began to understand that this was no longer about abstract moral questions. This was about survival, pure and simple. Rodriguez would not stop until he had her back under his control, and he would kill anyone who stood in his way. If she wanted to live, if she wanted Henry to live, she would have to be prepared to fight for both their lives. The transformation from helpless victim to potential combatant was terrifying, but it was also oddly liberating. For the first time since losing her sight, Janet felt like she had some measure of control over her fate. As the sun began to set, Henry came inside and sat down beside her by the fire. "Tomorrow we will work on the cabin's defenses," he said. "But tonight we rest." "Do you think they will come tomorrow?" "It is possible. Rodriguez is not a patient man, and losing 3 men will make him angry. Angry men make mistakes, but they also act quickly." Janet nodded, understanding that this might be their last peaceful evening together. The thought filled her with a mixture of sadness and urgency, a desire to make the most of whatever time they had left. "Henry," she said quietly. "Yes? If something happens to me, if Rodriguez gets what he wants, I want you to know that these past few days have been the happiest I have had since my husband died." Henry's hand found hers in the firelight. "Quote 622, he said firmly. Quote 623. Quote 624. Quote 625. The fierce certainty in his voice made Janet's heart race. She turned toward him, wishing desperately that she could see his face, could read the emotions she heard in his voice. "I do not want you to die for me," she said. "And I do not want to live in a world where men like Rodriguez can take whatever they want from people who cannot defend themselves," Henry replied. "Some things are worth fighting for, Janet. Some things are worth dying for." "Am I worth dying for?" Henry's other hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she had not realized had fallen. Quote 630, he said softly. Quote 631. The attack came at dawn, just as Henry had predicted. Janet woke to the sound of his voice, urgent but controlled, calling her name from the main room. Quote 632. She dressed quickly in the darkness that was her constant companion, her hands steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. The gun Henry had taught her to use was on the nightstand, and she picked it up with fingers that no longer trembled. She asked as she emerged from the bedroom. Henry replied. He was stationed at the front window, rifle in hand. Quote 635. Janet took her position by the back window as they had planned, though she could not see anything through the glass. Her job was to listen for anyone trying to approach from behind while Henry watched the front. Quote 636, she asked. Quote 637, the waiting was almost unbearable. Janet strained her ears for any sound that might indicate movement, but the morning was eerily quiet. Even the birds seemed to sense the danger and had fallen silent. Quote 638 Henry said suddenly on quote 639. Janet heard the sharp crack of his rifle, followed by a cry of pain from somewhere outside. The battle had begun. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions, bullets thudding into the cabin walls and shattering windows. Janet pressed herself against the floor, her heart hammering as the sound of destruction filled the air. Quote 640. Henry called over the noise. Quote 641. Janet heard him fire again, then curse as return fire forced him away from the window. The cabin that had been their sanctuary was rapidly becoming a trap. Quote 642, she called out, hearing the sound of splintering wood from that direction. Quote 643. Henry replied, and she heard his footsteps moving quickly across the room. The crash of the back door being kicked in was followed by heavy footsteps and shouted orders. Janet raised her pistol, pointing it toward the sounds, her finger on the trigger. A harsh voice commanded. Janet felt rough hands grab her arms, hauling her to her feet. The pistol was torn from her grasp before she could fire, and she found herself pressed against the wall with the cold barrel of a gun against her temple. The man holding her shouted, "Quotas 647. The gunfire stopped abruptly, leaving behind a ringing silence that was somehow more ominous than the chaos that had preceded it. Janet could hear Henry breathing heavily somewhere across the room, could sense his struggle between the desire to fight and the need to protect her. Quote 648, Henry said, his voice deadly calm. Quote 649. Quote 650. The man replied. Quote 651. Janet felt the gun barrel press harder against her skull, and she bit back a gasp of pain. The man holding her smelled of sweat and tobacco, his breathing harsh in her ear. Quote 652. Janet heard the sound of Henry's rifle hitting the floor, and her heart sank. Without his weapons, he was helpless against the men who had invaded their sanctuary. Good, the man said. Now step away from the gun and put your hands where we can see them. Janet heard Henry's footsteps moving across the room, could imagine him raising his hands in surrender. The man who had been willing to die to protect her was now defenseless, and it was all because of her. Quote 655, another voice commanded from the doorway. Quote 656. Janet was dragged toward what she assumed was the front door, the gun never leaving her temple. She stumbled on the threshold, and the man holding her jerked her upright with painful force. He snarled. The cold mountain air hit her face like a slap, and Janet realized she was outside the cabin for the first time since the storm. Under different circumstances, she might have enjoyed the sensation of fresh air and open space. Now, it only emphasized how exposed and vulnerable they had become. A familiar voice said, and Janet's blood turned to ice. Kevin Rodriguez was here just as Henry had predicted. Rodriguez, Henry said, and Janet could hear the barely controlled rage in his voice. Mr. Rodriguez to you, Garcia, the saloon owner replied smoothly. You have caused me a great deal of trouble and expense. 3 good men are dead because of your interference. 3 men are dead because they tried to kidnap an innocent woman, Henry shot back. The fault is yours for sending them. Rodriguez laughed, a sound devoid of humor or warmth. Innocent? Is that what she told you? Did she mention that she stole $500 from my safe before she ran away? I did not steal anything, Janet said, finding her voice despite her fear. You know that is a lie. Do I? Rodriguez asked. Then perhaps you can explain how the money went missing the same night you disappeared. Janet felt a chill of understanding. Rodriguez had staged the theft himself, creating justification for hunting her down. It was a clever move, giving him legal cover for what was essentially kidnapping and attempted rape. You took the money yourself, she said, to give yourself an excuse to come after me. Prove it, Rodriguez said with another laugh. Who is going to believe the word of a blind whore against a respected businessman? The casual cruelty of his words hit Janet like a physical blow, but she forced herself to stand straighter. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. What do you want? Henry asked, his voice tight with controlled fury. What I have always wanted, Rodriguez replied. My property returned to me. Miss Murphy owes me money, and she is going to work off that debt in whatever way I see fit. She is not your property, Henry said, and she does not owe you anything. That is not your decision to make, Garcia. You have interfered in my business for the last time. Janet heard the sound of footsteps moving closer, and she tensed, expecting violence. But instead of attacking Henry, Rodriguez moved to stand directly in front of her. You have led me on quite a chase, my dear, he said, and she could smell his cologne mixed with the stench of cigar smoke. But it is over now. You are coming back with me, and you are going to make up for all the trouble you have caused. I will never go with you willingly, Janet said, putting as much defiance into her voice as she could muster. Willingly? Rodriguez laughed again. Who said anything about willingly? You lost the right to choose when you stole from me. Janet felt his hand touch her cheek, a gesture that would have seemed tender to an observer, but felt like a violation to her. She jerked her head away, and Rodriguez's hand tightened, his fingers digging into her jaw. He said softly. Henry said, and the deadly calm in his voice made everyone around them go still. Code 687 Yet, Rodriguez asked, not removing his hand from Janet's face. You are outnumbered and outgunned, Garcia. You are in no position to make demands. I am in a position to promise you that if you hurt her, I will kill you, Henry replied. No matter how many men you have, no matter how long it takes, I will find a way. Rodriguez finally released Janet's face, but she could hear the amusement in his voice when he spoke. Quote 691 and quote 692, Henry said. Quote 693. The casual way Henry discussed his own death made Janet's heart clench with anguish. This man who had become so important to her, who had declared his love and given her hope for a future she had never imagined, was about to die because of her past mistakes. Actually, I was not planning to kill you, Rodriguez said thoughtfully. I was planning to let you live with the knowledge that you failed to protect the woman you care about. But perhaps you are right. Perhaps it would be simpler to just end this here. Janet heard the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked, and panic flooded through her system. She could not let Henry die for her, could not live with the knowledge that his blood was on her hands. Wait, she said desperately. I will go with you. I will do whatever you want. Just do not hurt him. Janet, no, Henry said immediately. Do not do this. I have to, she replied, tears streaming down her face. I cannot let you die because of me. How touching, Rodriguez said mockingly. True love conquers all. Very well, Miss Murphy. You have a deal. Come quietly, and your mountain man lives. Do not trust him, Henry warned. He will kill me anyway once he has what he wants. Perhaps, Rodriguez agreed, but this way you at least have a chance. Rapshi and I kill him right now. Janet felt the weight of the impossible choice crushing down on her. Go with Rodriguez and face whatever horrors he had planned for her, or watch the man she loved die in front of her. Either way, she lost everything that mattered. But at least if she went willingly, Henry would have a chance to survive, to escape, maybe even to come after her later. It was a slim hope, but it was better than watching him rot here in the snow. All right, she said quietly. I will come with you. Janet, please, Henry said, and she could hear the anguish in his voice. There has to be another way. There is no other way, she replied, turning toward the sound of his voice, though she could not see him. I love you, Henry Garcia. Remember that. Before Henry could respond, she felt hands grabbing her arms, pulling her away from the cabin and the man who had given her hope. As they dragged her toward what she assumed were horses, she heard Henry shouting her name, heard the sound of a struggle as he tried to break free from whoever was holding him. Let him go, she called back to Rodriguez. You have what you wanted. Indeed I do, Rodriguez replied, and she heard him mounting a horse nearby. Garcia, consider this a lesson in the price of interfering with other men's business. The next time you feel inclined to play hero, remember what it cost you. Janet was lifted roughly onto a horse, her hands tied to the saddle horn. As the group began to move away from the cabin, she heard Henry's voice one last time, carrying across the mountain air like a promise. The words gave her strength even as her heart broke. Henry Garcia was alive, and as long as he lived, there was hope. Rodriguez might think he had won, but he had made a crucial mistake. He had left alive a man with nothing left to lose, a man who would move heaven and earth to get back the woman he loved. The war was far from over. If anything, it had just begun. The journey down the mountain was a nightmare of cold, pain, and despair. Janet rode with her hands bound, her body aching from the unfamiliar position and the rough handling of her captors. Rodriguez had not spoken to her since they left the cabin, but she could feel his presence like a malevolent shadow, riding somewhere nearby. The men who guarded her were crude and violent, making crude jokes about what Rodriguez planned to do with her once they reached town. Janet tried to block out their words, focusing instead on the rhythm of the horse beneath her and the hope that Henry was still alive back at the cabin. As the hours passed, the mountain air grew warmer, and Janet realized they were descending toward the lower elevations where towns and civilization waited. Each step took her further from the sanctuary she had found with Henry, deeper into a world where Rodriguez's money and influence could protect him from the consequences of his actions. Not much further now, one of the men said as they stopped to rest the horses. Another hour, and we will be in Millfield. Millfield. Janet had heard of the town, a rough mining settlement where law was scarce and men like Rodriguez could operate with impunity. Once they reached it, her chances of escape would diminish to almost nothing. "Enjoying the ride, my dear?" Rodriguez asked, riding up beside her. Janet remained silent, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a response. "Still playing the defiant victim, I see," Rodriguez continued. "That will change soon enough. I have plans for you, Janet. Plans that will teach you the proper place of women who think they can defy men like me." "Henry will come for me," Janet said quietly. Rodriguez laughed. "Your mountain man? Assuming my men did not kill him after we left, what makes you think he could find you? He is one man against an army, a hermit against a businessman with resources and connections." "You do not know him," Janet replied. "You do not know what he is capable of." "I know he is a fool who threw away his life for a woman who was never worth saving," Rodriguez said cruelly. "But do not worry, my dear. You will forget it all about him soon enough." The casual cruelty of his words made Janet's stomach turn, but she forced herself to remain calm. Rodriguez wanted her to break, wanted to see her despair and beg for mercy. She would not give him that satisfaction. As they resumed their journey, Janet found herself thinking about the skills Henry had been teaching her, the ways he had shown her to navigate the world without sight. Even bound and helpless on a horse, she was gathering information, building a mental map of the route they were taking. The sound of the horse's hooves had changed, suggesting they were now on a proper road rather than mountain trails. She could hear the distant sound of machinery, probably mining equipment, and the smell of wood smoke from numerous fires. They were approaching civilization, such as it was in this remote part of Colorado. "There it is," one of the men said. "Millfield." Janet heard the sounds of a busy town growing louder around them. Voices, horses, the creak of wagon wheels, the sound of hammering and sawing. It was a stark contrast to the peaceful silence of Henry's mountain cabin. Rodriguez ordered. Janet was pulled roughly from her horse and dragged through what sounded like busy streets. People called out greetings to Rodriguez, their voices respectful and deferential. Whatever else he might be, he was clearly a man of importance in this town. The saloon was exactly what Janet had expected, loud and smoky, filled with the sounds of drinking and gambling. She was hustled up a flight of stairs and shoved into a room that smelled of cheap perfume and stale alcohol. Quote 734, one of the guards said with a laugh. Quote 735 tone. The door slammed shut, and Janet heard the sound of a key turning in the lock. She was alone for the first time since the attack on the cabin, and the silence felt both blessing and curse. Janet explored her prison carefully, using the techniques Henry had taught her. The room was small, with a bed, a washstand, and a single chair. There was a window, but when she tried to open it, she found it had been nailed shut. The door was solid wood with no give when she tested it. She was trapped, just as Rodriguez had intended. But as Janet sat on the bed and tried to plan her next move, she heard something that made her heart leap with hope. Somewhere in the distance, barely audible over the sounds of the town, was the sound of a single rider approaching at great speed. Henry had come for her, just as he had promised. The sound of the approaching rider grew louder, and Janet heard shouts from the street below. Someone was coming into town fast and hard, and the people of Millfield were taking notice. Quote 736, she heard one of her guards say from the hallway outside her door. Quote 737, and the other replied. Quote 738. But Janet knew better. She could feel it in her bones, could sense the approaching storm. That was Henry Garcia coming to reclaim what was his. Rodriguez had made the mistake of leaving alive a man who had nothing left to lose, and now he was going to pay the price for that error. The sound of gunfire erupted from somewhere below, followed by screams and shouts of alarm. Janet pressed herself against the wall, her heart racing as she listened to the sounds of battle spreading through the saloon. Quote 739, one of the guards demanded, and she heard him moving toward the stairs. Quote 740, a voice roared from below, a voice Janet recognized with a mixture of joy and terror. Quote 741. Henry had come, just as he had promised, but he was one man against an entire town of Rodriguez's allies and employees. The odds against him were overwhelming, and Janet feared that his rescue attempt would only result in his death. The gunfire intensified, and Janet heard heavy footsteps on the stairs. Someone was coming up, and she could only hope it was Henry rather than more of Rodriguez's men. The door to her room exploded inward, and Janet heard a familiar voice calling her name. Quote 742, quote 743, she cried, stumbling toward the sound of his voice. Quote 744 key. Strong arms wrapped around her, and she felt the solid warmth of his chest against her cheek. For a moment, the terror and despair of the past hours faded away, replaced by the overwhelming relief of being in his arms again. Henry said, his voice tight with emotion. Quote 746. Quote 747. Janet said urgently. Quote 748. Quote 749. Henry replied grimly. Quote 750. Before Janet could ask what he meant, she heard footsteps in the hallway outside. Rodriguez's voice called out, filled with anger and disbelief. Garcia, you should have stayed on your mountain and mourned your loss like a civilized man. I should have killed you the moment I learned your name, Henry replied, his voice deadly calm. You are outnumbered 10-1, Rodriguez said. Surrender now and I might let you live long enough to watch what I do to your woman. Come and take her, Henry said simply. The silence that followed was pregnant with violence, and Janet could feel the tension crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. Two men who had declared war on each other were about to settle their difference with blood, and she was trapped in the middle. Henry, she whispered, there are too many of them. We should run. There is nowhere to run, Henry replied quietly. Rodriguez will never stop hunting us. This ends here one way or another. Janet heard the sound of guns being drawn, and she knew that the next few moments would determine whether they lived or died together. The man she loved was about to risk everything in a confrontation that would leave only one of them standing. The war for her freedom was about to reach its climax, and Janet could only pray that love and determination would be enough to overcome the odds stacked against them. The confrontation erupted with the sudden violence of a thunderclap. Janet heard the roar of gunfire from multiple directions, the crash of bodies hitting walls, the splintering of wood as bullets tore through the flimsy construction of the saloon's upper floor. Henry pushed her down behind the bed, his body shielding her from the chaos that had erupted in the hallway. He commanded, his voice barely audible over the sound of battle. Janet pressed herself against the floor, her hands covering her ears as the violence raged around her. She could hear Henry moving with deadly purpose, his gun speaking in measured rhythm as he engaged Rodriguez's men. Each shot was deliberate, controlled, the work of a man who had learned to kill efficiently in the crucible of war. Garcia! Rodriguez's voice cut through the noise, filled with rage and desperation. 762. Henry's response was another carefully aimed shot, followed by a cry of pain from somewhere in the hallway. Janet heard bodies hitting the floor, heard the groans of wounded men, heard the terrible sounds of violence and death. But even as Henry fought with skill and determination, Janet knew that Rodriguez was right. There were too many enemies, too many guns arrayed against them. Sooner or later, Henry's luck would run out, and they would both die in this squalid room above a frontier saloon. Quote 763, she heard Henry say during a brief lull in the fighting. Quote 764 win. Janet crawled to the window she had found nailed shut earlier, feeling frantically for something to use as a weapon. Her hands closed around a heavy ceramic pitcher from the washstand, and she swung it with all her strength against the glass. The window shattered, letting in a rush of cold air and the sounds of the town below. Janet heard people shouting in the streets, some calling for the sheriff, others placing bets on the outcome of the fight. Quote 765 Henry asked, reloading his pistol with practiced speed. Janet stuck her head out the window, trying to gauge the distance to the ground. It felt impossibly far, and she had no way to see what lay below. She said honestly. Henry replied grimly. The shooting resumed with renewed intensity as more of Rodriguez's men reached the second floor. Janet could hear them spreading out, trying to surround the room where she and Henry had taken refuge. This is your last chance, Garcia, Rodriguez called out. Surrender the woman, and I will make your death quick. Go to hell, Henry replied, and punctuated his response with another shot. Janet heard someone cry out in pain, but the sound was immediately followed by more gunfire from multiple directions. They were being overwhelmed, and she knew it was only a matter of time before the sheer weight of numbers told against them. That was when she heard something that made her heart leap with hope. New voices in the street below, authoritative and commanding. Someone was shouting orders, and the tone suggested official authority. "This is Sheriff Wilson. What the hell is going on up there?" Janet felt a surge of relief. If the law had arrived, perhaps there was still hope for justice. Still a chance that she and Henry might survive this nightmare. But her relief was short-lived. Rodriguez's voice called down from the window of another room, smooth and confident. Boat 772. Janet's heart sank as she realized that Rodriguez was spinning the situation to his advantage, painting himself as the victim and Henry as the aggressor. In a town where Rodriguez held power and influence, his word would carry more weight than that of a stranger. "Garcia!" The sheriff's voice boomed up from the street. "I quote 774 you, quote 0775 ye." Janet whispered urgently to Henry. Quote 776 while Henry nodded grimly, understanding the trap they had fallen into. Even if they survived the immediate battle, they would face a legal system corrupted by Rodriguez's money and influence. "There has to be another way," Janet said desperately. Henry was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a new determination. "There is," he said, "but you are not going to like it." "What do you mean?" "I am going to create a distraction," Henry said. "When I do, you are going to climb out that window and run. Do not stop, do not look back. Just run until you find someone who can help you." "No," Janet said immediately. "I am not leaving you." "You have to," Henry replied firmly. "This is the only way to get you out of here alive." "What about you?" Henry's hand found hers in the chaos, squeezing gently. Quote 788, he said, but Janet could hear the lie in his voice. Quote 789, she said, tears streaming down her face. Quote 790, quote 791, Henry said simply. Quote 792, Janet said fiercely. Quote 793. Before Henry could argue further, the attack resumed with devastating intensity. Rodriguez's men had apparently decided to end the standoff with overwhelming force, and bullets poured into the room from multiple directions. Henry returned fire with grim efficiency, but Janet could hear that he was running low on ammunition. Each shot was precious now, each one potentially the difference between life and death. "Garcia!" Rodriguez's voice called out again. Quote 795. The casual way Rodriguez discussed her death made Janet's blood boil with rage. This man who saw her as property, who thought he could buy and sell human lives like cattle, represented everything evil and corrupt in the world. "Henry," she said quietly, an idea forming in her mind. "What? Can you get me close to Rodriguez?" Henry looked at her in surprise, though she could not see his expression. "What are you talking about?" "You said I should learn to defend myself," Janet said. "You taught me to use a gun. Can you get me close enough to Rodriguez to use what you taught me?" "Janet, no," Henry said immediately. "It is too dangerous." "It is the only way," she replied, echoing his earlier words. "As long as Rodriguez is alive, he will never stop hunting us. But if he dies, his men lose their reason to fight." Henry was quiet for a moment, considering her proposal. When he spoke, his voice was filled with admiration and fear in equal measure. "It might work," he admitted. "But if you miss, if something goes wrong, then we die together," Janet said simply. "But at least we die fighting." Henry handed her one of his pistols, and Janet felt the familiar weight of the weapon in her hands. All the practice sessions in the mountains, all the lessons in shooting by sound and instinct, had been leading to this moment. "I love you," she said quietly. "I love you too," Henry replied. "Now let us go kill the bastard who thinks he owns you." The final battle was about to begin, and Janet Murphy was no longer a helpless victim. She was a woman with a gun and a cause worth dying for, and Kevin Rodriguez was about to learn the difference. The plan Henry devised was simple in its audacity and terrifying in its execution. He would draw the attention of Rodriguez's men by making a frontal assault down the hallway, while Janet slipped out through the broken window and made her way around to the back of the building where Rodriguez was coordinating the attack. Henry said as he checked his weapons one final time. "Quotomitrum." Janet nodded, though her hands were shaking as she held the pistol. The idea of deliberately seeking out a confrontation with Rodriguez terrified her, but she knew it was their only chance of survival. She asked, quote 816, Henry said, and immediately opened fire on the men in the hallway. The response was immediate and overwhelming. with Rodriguez's men returning fire with everything they had. In the chaos of the gunfight, Janet slipped out through the broken window, feeling carefully for handholds on the rough wooden siding of the building. The climb down was a nightmare of splinters and uncertain footing, made worse by her inability to see where she was going. More than once, she nearly lost her grip and fell, but somehow she managed to reach the ground safely. The alley behind the saloon was dark and narrow, filled with the detritus of frontier life. Janet moved carefully through the obstacles, following the sound of Rodriguez's voice as he shouted orders to his men. Quote, 817, she heard him say. Quote, 818 mon. The casual brutality of the order made Janet's stomach clench with fear and rage. Rodriguez was willing to destroy his own property just to ensure their deaths, and he clearly did not care how many innocent people might be caught in the fire. Janet crept closer to the source of his voice, using the skills Henry had taught her to move silently through the darkness. She could hear Rodriguez clearly now, could smell his expensive cologne mixed with the stench of fierce sweat. "You, get some kerosene from the storage room," Rodriguez ordered one of his men. "And you, make sure the front door is blocked. I do not want anyone getting out of there alive." Janet raised the pistol, trying to judge the distance to Rodriguez's voice. She would only get one shot, and if she missed, she would be dead before she could reload. A new voice called out from the street, quote, 822. Janet heard Rodriguez curse under his breath before answering in a smooth, controlled tone. Quote, 823. Quote, 824. The sheriff replied, and Janet could hear the concern in his voice. Quote, 825 through it, though. Quote, 826, Rodriguez said. Quote, 827. Janet realized this was her chance. With the sheriff present, Rodriguez would be distracted, focused on maintaining his facade of respectability. She crept closer, using a pile of wooden crates for cover. The sheriff said. Rodriguez laughed bitterly. Janet was close enough now to hear Rodriguez's breathing, to sense his presence just a few feet away. She raised the pistol, steadying it with both hands as Henry had taught her, and prepared to fire. "Rodriguez!" Henry's voice suddenly roared from somewhere above them. Quote, 832. The sound of Henry's voice, strong and defiant, despite everything he had endured, gave Janet the courage she needed. She stepped out from behind the crates, pointing the pistol toward the sound of Rodriguez's breathing. Quote, 833, she said quietly. She heard him gasp in surprise, heard the scrape of his boots as he turned toward her voice. Quote, 834. Quote, Janet replied. Quote, Rodriguez said, but there was fear in his voice now. Quote, quote, Janet agreed. Quote, 839. She heard Rodriguez take a step backward, heard the sheriff calling out in confusion as he tried to understand what was happening. Quote, 840, Wilson demanded. Quote, one, quote, Torson, Rodriguez said quickly. Quote, Arson, quote, Iron, Janet said, her voice carrying clearly in the night air. Quote, Arson, quote, Ofran, Rodriguez snarled. Quote, Janet replied. Quote, Otterman. She heard murmurs from the crowd that had gathered to watch the confrontation, and she realized that her words were having an impact. Rodriguez's reputation was built on his image as a respectable businessman, and public accusations of impropriety could damage that carefully constructed facade. "She is lying," Rodriguez said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Am I?" Janet asked. "Then why did you send armed men to kidnap me from a remote mountain cabin? Why did you track me across hundreds of miles of wilderness? What kind of businessman goes to such lengths to recover $500? The questions hung in the air like accusations, and Janet could sense the crowd's growing skepticism about Rodriguez's version of events. "The woman is clearly delusional," Rodriguez said desperately. "She has been living in the wilderness with a known criminal. Who knows what lies he has filled her head with?" "The only lies here are the ones you tell yourself," Janet said. "You think your money and power give you the right to take whatever you want from people who cannot defend themselves. But you are wrong." She heard Rodriguez moving, probably reaching for his own weapon, and she knew the moment of decision had arrived. "Sheriff Wilson," she called out, keeping the pistol trained on Rodriguez, "I want you to know that whatever happens here, Kevin Rodriguez is not the man he pretends to be. He is a predator who uses his position to abuse women, and he will kill anyone who tries to stop him. That is enough, Rodriguez snarled, and Janet heard the unmistakable sound of a gun being drawn. Time seemed to slow as Janet made her choice. She could surrender, could trust in the sheriff's protection and the hope of justice through legal means. Or she could end this here and now with a single shot that would free her and Henry from Rodriguez's pursuit forever. The decision was easier than she had expected. Rodriguez had proven that he would never stop, would never give up his pursuit of what he considered his property. Legal justice was a luxury she could not afford when dealing with a man who owned the very system that was supposed to protect her. Janet pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the night like thunder, followed by the sound of Rodriguez's body hitting the ground. For a moment, the entire crowd was silent, stunned by the sudden violence. Then chaos erupted as Rodriguez's men realized their employer was dead and the sheriff tried to restore order. Janet stood frozen in place, the smoking pistol still in her hands, unable to believe that she had actually done it. "Janet!" Henry's voice called out from somewhere above. Quote 860 song, quote 861 mom, she called back, though she was not sure if that was the same thing as being all right. She heard heavy footsteps approaching and tensed, expecting Rodriguez's men to seek immediate revenge. Instead, she heard the sheriff's voice, calm and authoritative. Janet lowered the pistol, though she did not release it entirely. Quote, a shuddered, quote, Iron, Wilson said carefully. Quote, Arford, quote, Janet replied, and quote, Adam, the sheriff did. Quote, Allen, as Henry made his way down from the saloon and the crowd began to disperse, Janet realized that the nightmare was finally over. Rodriguez was dead, his men were scattered, and for the first time in months, she was truly free. But freedom had come at a price, and as she stood in the darkness holding a gun that still smelled of gunpowder, Janet wondered what kind of person she had become in her fight for survival. The woman who had stumbled blind through a Colorado blizzard just days ago was gone, replaced by someone harder, more dangerous, more willing to fight for what she believed in. Whether that transformation was a victory or a tragedy remained to be seen. The aftermath of Rodriguez's death brought a strange calm to the chaotic streets of Millfield. His men, leaderless and uncertain, melted away into the night rather than face the questions of a sheriff who was beginning to understand the true nature of their employer's business. Janet sat in Sheriff Wilson's office, Henry beside her as they told their story to a lawman who listened with growing disgust and anger. The tale of Rodriguez's pursuit, of the attacks on Henry's cabin, of the systematic abuse of power and position, painted a picture that explained much about the corruption that had plagued the town. I always wondered how Rodriguez managed to keep so many men on his payroll, Wilson said when they had finished. Now I understand. He was not running a business, he was running a criminal enterprise. Will there be charges? Henry asked quietly. Wilson considered the question carefully. Against Miss Murphy for killing Rodriguez? I doubt it. Too many witnesses heard her accusations, and too many people in this town have stories about Rodriguez that they were afraid to tell while he was alive. Janet felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had been prepared to face whatever legal consequences came from her actions, but the prospect of true freedom was almost too wonderful to contemplate. What about his men? She asked. The ones who attacked the cabin? Dead or scattered, Wilson replied. Without Rodriguez's money to pay them, they have no reason to continue his vendetta. You should be safe now. Safe. The word felt foreign to Janet after so many months of running and hiding. She tried to imagine what safety might feel like, what it would be like to wake up each morning without fear. What will you do now? Wilson asked. Janet looked toward Henry, though she could not see his face. The question of their future had been hanging unspoken between them since the moment Rodriguez died. I do not know, she admitted. I suppose I need to find work, somewhere to live. You could stay here in Millfield, Wilson suggested. The town will need new leadership now that Rodriguez is gone. There might be opportunities. Janet felt Henry shift beside her, and she sensed his tension at the suggestion. The idea of staying in the town where she had killed a man, where reminders of violence and corruption would surround her daily, held no appeal. I think we would prefer somewhere quieter, Henry said carefully. We? Wilson asked, and Janet heard the curiosity in his voice. Miss Murphy and I have become close, Henry said. We would like to build a life together, somewhere peaceful. The simple statement sent a thrill through Janet's heart. Despite everything they had endured, despite the violence and death that had surrounded them, Henry still wanted a future with her. Quote 886. Wilson said with what sounded like a smile. Quote 7. They left the sheriff's office as the sun was beginning to rise over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that Janet could not see but could sense in the warmth on her face. The town was quiet now, the excitement of the night's events having given way to the ordinary business of mourning. Quote 818, Janet asked as they walked slowly down the main street. Quote 889, Henry said. Quote 890 home. The word resonated in Janet's heart like a bell. The remote mountain cabin that had been her sanctuary, her school, and her fortress was indeed home now in a way that no place had been since David's death. Quote 891, she asked. Henry stopped walking and turned to face her, his hands finding hers in the growing light. Quote 892, he said simply. Quote 893. Janet felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. Quote 894, she said. Quote 895, he replied. Quote 896. As they began the long journey back up the mountain, back to the cabin that waited for them among the pines, Janet reflected on the incredible transformation her life had undergone. She had started as a helpless victim, blind and abandoned in a hostile wilderness. She had become a woman who could defend herself and those she loved, who could face down evil and emerge victorious. The blindness that had once seemed like the end of everything had become just another obstacle to overcome, no more defining than any other challenge life might present. She had learned to see with her heart instead of her eyes, to navigate by love instead of sight. Behind them, the town of Millfield was waking up to a new reality, free from the corruption and fear that had dominated it for so long. Ahead of them lay a future bright with possibility, a life built on love and mutual respect rather than power and domination. The war for Janet's freedom was over, but the battle for happiness was just beginning. And as she walked hand in hand with the man who had saved her life and won her heart, Janet knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The mountain path stretched before them, leading home to a life she had never imagined possible. And for the first time since the fever had stolen her sight, Janet Murphy could see her future clearly. It was beautiful. As they climbed higher into the mountains, leaving the corruption and violence of Millfield behind them, Janet found herself thinking about the woman she had been just a week ago. That woman had been broken, defeated, ready to give up on life itself. She had seen her blindness as the end of everything meaningful, a barrier that would forever separate her from the world of the living. Now walking beside the man who had taught her that strength came from within rather than from what others could see, Janet understood that her blindness had not ended her life. It had simply changed the way she experienced it, forcing her to develop senses and abilities she had never known she possessed. Henry, she said as they paused to rest beside a mountain stream. Yes? Do you think I will ever regain my sight? Henry was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. I do not know, he said finally, but I know that it does not matter. What do you mean? I mean that you are perfect exactly as you are, Henry said, his voice filled with a conviction. Your blindness is part of you, but it does not define you. You are strong, brave, intelligent, and beautiful, and none of those things depend on your ability to see. Janet felt her heart swell with emotion at his words. She had spent so many months thinking of herself as damaged, incomplete, a burden to anyone who might care about her. Henry saw her differently, saw her as whole and valuable and worthy of love. I never thought I would be happy again, she admitted. And now? Now I think happiness might be possible, Janet said. Not the same kind I had before, but something new, something better. They resumed their journey as the sun climbed higher in the sky, warming the mountain air and melting the last remnants of the snow that had nearly killed Janet just days earlier. The world around them was coming alive with the sounds of spring, birds calling from the trees, water running in countless streams, the whisper of wind through new leaves. Janet found herself cataloging these sounds, building a rich tapestry of sensation that painted the world around her in ways that sight never could. She could hear the different calls of various birds, could distinguish between the sound of wind in pine needles versus the rustle of aspen leaves, could sense the presence of wildlife moving through the forest around them. "You are learning to see with more than your eyes," Henry observed, noticing her attention to the sounds around them. "You taught me that," Janet said. "You taught me that there are many ways to experience the world." "You taught yourself," Henry corrected. "I just gave you the tools. You did the work." As they approached the familiar landmarks that marked the approach to Henry's cabin, Janet felt a sense of homecoming that surprised her with its intensity. This remote, isolated place had become more than just a shelter from the storm. It had become the place where she had discovered who she really was, where she had learned to love and be loved in return. Henry said as they crested the final ridge, quote 915 on, Janet could not see the cabin, but she could smell the familiar scent of pine smoke from the chimney, could hear the sound of wind chimes that Henry had hung from the porch roof. Every sense told her that she was truly home. They spent the rest of the day restoring the cabin to order, repairing the damage from the attack, and making it livable again. Janet worked alongside Henry, her hands sure and confident as she performed tasks that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. As evening approached, they sat together by the fire, listening to the peaceful sounds of the mountains settling into night. The violence and terror of recent days seemed like something from another lifetime, a nightmare that had finally ended. Henry said quietly, quote 917 to quote 918, the simple question hit Janet like a bolt of lightning, filling her with joy so intense it was almost painful. She had hoped, had dreamed, but had not dared to assume that Henry's feelings ran deep enough for such a commitment. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." Henry's arms came around her, pulling her close, and Janet felt the last walls around her heart crumble away. She had found not just safety and shelter in this mountain refuge, but love and partnership and the promise of a future worth living. Quote 921, she asked. Quote 922. Henry begged with a laugh. Quote 923. Quote 924, Janet said immediately. Quote taunted, quote Tom. Henry agreed as they held each other in the firelight, planning a future that neither of them could have imagined just days earlier. Janet reflected on the strange journey that had brought them together. She had lost her sight, her security, her old life, everything she thought she needed to be happy. In return, she had found strength, courage, love, and a purpose she had never known she was seeking. The trade seemed impossibly uneven, except that she would not change a single moment of it. The blind woman who had stumbled through a Colorado blizzard was gone, replaced by someone stronger, braver, more complete than she had ever been before. And the man who had saved her life had found his own salvation in the process, discovering that love could heal even the deepest wounds. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adventures, new opportunities to grow and learn together. But tonight they were simply two people who had found each other against all odds, who had chosen love over fear, hope over despair. Outside, the mountain winds sang through the pines, a lullaby that spoke of peace and safety and the promise of better days ahead. Inside, by the warmth of the fire, Janet Murphy and Henry Garcia began to plan the life they would build together, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of love at a time. The darkness that had once seemed like the end of everything had become the beginning of something beautiful. And in that darkness, our darkness, illuminated by love and hope and the unshakable bond between two souls who had found their perfect match, the future stretched out before them like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. The spring that followed their engagement brought changes to the mountain that mirrored the transformation in Janet's own life. Where once she had seen only darkness and limitation, she now found endless possibilities for growth and discovery. The cabin that had been her refuge became her workshop, her laboratory for learning to live fully in a world she navigated by touch, sound, and instinct. Henry had fashioned a garden plot on the southern slope where the soil was rich and the sun lingered longest. Janet worked beside him, her hands learning to distinguish between the delicate shoots of vegetables and the stubborn persistence of weeds. The earth spoke to her in ways she had never imagined, each plant carrying its own texture, its own scent, its own story of growth and struggle. "The tomatoes are ready for staking," Henry said one morning as they knelt together among the rows. Can you feel how the stems are beginning to bend under their own weight? Janet's fingers traced the length of a tomato plant, feeling the subtle curve that indicated its need for support. A month ago, she would have needed Henry to point out such details. Now she could sense them herself, her hands reading the language of growing things with increasing fluency. Quote 929, she said, touching the soil around a bean plant. Quote 930. Henry checked her assessment and smiled. Quote 931. It was true. Janet had discovered that her other senses, freed from the dominance of sight, were developing with remarkable speed. She could identify birds by the subtle differences in their calls, could predict weather changes by the shift in air pressure against her skin, could navigate the forest paths around the cabin with confidence that surprised even Henry. But perhaps the most profound change was in her relationship with Henry himself. The desperate gratitude and dependence of those first weeks had evolved into something deeper and more balanced. They had become true partners, each contributing their own strengths to their shared life, Henry said as they finished their morning work in the garden. Quote 933. He led her to a spot behind the cabin where she had never been before, guiding her carefully over unfamiliar ground. The sound of running water grew louder as they walked, and Janet realized they were approaching a stream she had heard but never visited. Quote 934, Henry warned as they descended a gentle slope. Quote 935, quote, Janet felt the cool mist from the water on her face before Henry helped her step onto what felt like a large, flat boulder beside the stream. The sound of flowing water was all around them now, creating a natural symphony that spoke of peace and timeless continuity. Quote 936, she asked. Quote 937, Henry said simply. Janet felt her breath catch. They had talked about marriage in general terms, but the reality of it had seemed distant, something to be planned for an indefinite future. Now, with the sound of the stream providing nature's own music and the warm sun on her face, the idea became immediate and real. When? She asked. Next week, if you agree, Henry replied. I sent word to Reverend Long down in Cedar Falls. He is willing to make the journey up here to perform the ceremony. Janet felt tears of joy sliding down her cheeks. Next week seems perfect. They spent the rest of the morning planning the simple ceremony that would unite their lives officially as well as emotionally. There would be no guests except for the Reverend, no elaborate preparations, just two people making promises to each other in the presence of God and the wilderness that had brought them together. I have something for you, Henry said as they walked back toward the cabin. Janet heard him rummaging in his pocket, then felt him take her left hand in his. Something cool and smooth slid onto her ring finger, and she gasped as she realized what it was. A ring, she whispered, touching the simple band with her other hand. It was my grandmother's, Henry said. My mother gave it to me before she died, told me to save it for the woman I would love enough to spend my life with. Janet explored the ring with her fingertips, feeling the worn smoothness of the gold and what felt like a small stone set into the band. It was simple and elegant, exactly what she would have chosen for herself. It is beautiful, she said, but how do you know it fits? I measured your finger while you were sleeping, Henry admitted with a laugh. I wanted it to be a surprise. The thoughtfulness of the gesture, the planning and care that had gone into making this moment perfect, overwhelmed Janet with emotion. She had never expected to wear a wedding ring again, had assumed that part of her life was over when David died. I love you, she said, throwing her arms around Henry's neck. Quote 951, Austin. As they held each other beside the mountain stream, Janet reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. Less than 6 months ago, she had been a broken woman, stumbling blind through a snowstorm, ready to give up on life itself. Now she was preparing to marry a man who had shown her that love could indeed conquer all obstacles, that two people committed to each other could overcome any challenge. The week that followed passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Janet worked on altering a dress that had belonged to Henry's mother, using her sewing skills to transform the simple blue fabric into something suitable for a mountain wedding. Henry cleaned and organized the cabin, chopped extra firewood, and prepared a special dinner for their wedding day. Reverend Poneman Long arrived on a Thursday afternoon, a kindly man in his 60s who had spent his life ministering to the scattered communities of the Colorado mountains. He was not surprised by Janet's blindness, having been prepared by Henry's message, but he was clearly impressed by her composure and independence. "I have performed many weddings in my time," he told them over dinner that first night, "but I have rarely seen two people who seem so perfectly suited to each other." "We have been through a great deal together," Henry said simply. "The best marriages are forged in adversity," the Reverend replied. "When two people can support each other through hardship, they can face anything life brings." That night, Janet lay awake thinking about the ceremony that would take place the next day. She had been married before, of course, but that wedding seemed like something from another lifetime. A formal affair conducted in a church filled with people she barely knew. Tomorrow's ceremony would be different. It would be intimate, personal, conducted in the place where she and Henry had found each other and built their love. There would be no elaborate dress, no flowers, no reception with dozens of guests. Just two people making promises that came from the depths of their hearts. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and warm, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of pine and wildflowers through the cabin windows. Janet dressed carefully in the blue dress she had altered, her fingers steady as she arranged her hair in a simple style that Henry had told her looked beautiful. "Huddle 957, Henry asked when she emerged from the bedroom. Quote 958, Janet replied. They walked together to the stream where Henry had proposed, Reverend Long following behind them with his worn Bible and gentle smile. The sound of flowing water provided a natural processional as they took their places on the flat boulder where they would exchange vows. Quote 959. The Reverend began, his voice carrying clearly over the sound of the stream. Quote 960 pound, Janet listened to the familiar words with a sense of wonder. She could not see the Reverend's face or Henry's expression, but she could feel the weight and importance of the moment in every word that was spoken. Quote 961, the Reverend Long continued, quoted 962. When it came time for their vows, Henry spoke first, his voice steady and sure. Quoted 963. Janet felt tears streaming down her face as she spoke her own vows. Quote 964 term, when Reverend Long pronounced them husband and wife, Henry's lips found hers in a kiss that sealed their commitment and marked the beginning of their new life together. The sound of the stream seemed to grow louder, as if nature itself was celebrating their union. The months that followed their wedding brought a contentment to Janet's life that she had never experienced before. She and Henry settled into the rhythms of married life with an ease that surprised them both, their different strengths complementing each other in ways that made their partnership stronger than either of them could have been alone. Janet's skills in managing the household had grown remarkably. She could cook elaborate meals, using only touch and smell to guide her, could mend clothes with stitches so precise that Henry marveled at their evenness, could organize their supplies with an efficiency that came from knowing exactly where everything belonged. But perhaps more importantly, she had begun to venture beyond the immediate area around the cabin, exploring the mountain paths with a confidence that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Henry had taught her to read the landscape through her feet and hands, to navigate by the sound of streams in the direction of the wind, to recognize landmarks through their unique textures and scents. I want to show you the waterfall, Henry said one morning in early summer. It is about 2 miles up the mountain, but the path is not too difficult. Janet had heard the distant sound of falling water during quiet moments, a faint roar that spoke of something magnificent hidden in the heights above them. The idea of actually visiting the source of that sound filled her with excitement. They set out after breakfast, Henry carrying a pack with food and water for the journey. The path climbed steadily through stands of aspen and pine, the air growing cooler and thinner as they gained elevation. Janet used a walking stick that Henry had carved for her, testing each step carefully but moving with growing confidence. Tell me what you see, she said as they paused to rest beside a mountain meadow. Wildflowers everywhere, Henry replied. Purple lupines, yellow paintbrush, white columbines dancing in the breeze, and beyond them peaks that stretched to the horizon, their tops still touched with snow even in summer. Janet closed her eyes, though the gesture was purely symbolic, and tried to picture the scene Henry described. She could smell the flowers, could feel the warmth of the sun and the coolness of the mountain breeze, could sense the vastness of the landscape around them, even without seeing it. It sounds beautiful, she said. It is, Henry agreed, but not as beautiful as you. The simple compliment made Janet's heart flutter with the same joy she had felt on their wedding day. Henry had a gift for making her feel beautiful and cherished, despite the disability that had once made her feel worthless and unwanted. They resumed their climb, and gradually the sound of falling water grew louder. Janet could feel the mist in the air before they reached their destination, could sense the power and majesty of the waterfall through the vibrations in the ground beneath her feet. Quote 973, Henry said, guiding her to a large rock where they could sit and rest. The sound was overwhelming, a thunderous roar that seemed to shake the very mountains. Janet could feel the spray on her face, could sense the immense volume of water plunging from somewhere high above them into the pool below. She asked, raising her voice to be heard over the noise. Quote 975, Henry replied. Quoted 976. Janet tried to imagine the waterfall, to build a picture in her mind from the sounds and sensations around her. The constant roar spoke of tremendous power, while the fine mist that touched her skin suggested grace and beauty. It was like nature's own cathedral, a place of worship carved from stone and water. They ate their lunch beside the waterfall, talking little but feeling the deep connection that came from sharing something magnificent together. Janet found herself thinking about how different this experience was from what it would have been if she could see. Instead of being distracted by the visual spectacle, she was forced to experience the waterfall with her whole being, to feel its power and beauty in ways that went beyond mere sight. I'm glad I am blind, she said suddenly, surprising herself with the words. What do you mean? Henry asked. I mean that if I could see, I would be looking at the waterfall instead of experiencing it, Janet explained. I would be focused on how it looks instead of how it feels, how it sounds, how it makes me feel inside. Henry was quiet for a moment, considering her words. I never thought of it that way, he said finally. My blindness forces me to experience the world differently, Janet continued. Not better or worse, just differently. And sometimes I think that different way of experiencing things is actually more complete. It was a revelation that had been building in Janet's mind for months, the growing understanding that her disability was not simply a limitation to be overcome, but a different way of being in the world that had its own gifts and insights. Quote Henry said, quote item, they made their way back down the mountain as the afternoon sun began to slant through the trees, both of them quiet but content. The journey to the waterfall had been more than just a pleasant excursion. It had been a confirmation of Janet's growing confidence in her ability to navigate and enjoy the world despite her blindness. That evening, as they sat by the fire listening to the night sounds of the forest, Janet found herself reflecting on how much her life had changed since that terrible night when the fever had stolen her sight. She had lost one way of seeing the world, but she had gained so much more. A deeper appreciation for the richness of sensation, a stronger connection to the natural world, and most importantly, a love that had transformed her understanding of what it meant to be truly alive. Henry, she said as they prepared for bed. Yes. Do you ever regret it? Marrying a blind woman, I mean, taking on the burden of caring for someone who cannot see? Henry stopped what he was doing and came to sit beside her on the bed. His hands found her face, his thumbs gently wiping away tears she had not realized were falling. Janet Garcia, he said, using her married name with deliberate emphasis, you are not a burden. You are the greatest gift I have ever received. Your blindness is part of who you are, but it does not define you any more than my scars define me. Your scars? Henry took her hands and guided them to his chest, where she felt the raised lines of old wounds she had noticed before, but never asked about. From the war, he said simply, from fights with men who wanted to hurt people I cared about, from a life that was hard long before I met you. Janet traced the scars with her fingertips, feeling the stories they told of pain and healing, of survival and strength. We are both marked by our experiences, Henry continued, but those marks do not make us less than we were before. They make us who we are now, and who we are now is perfect for each other. The simple truth of his words settled into Janet's heart like a healing balm. She had spent so many months thinking of herself as damaged goods, as someone who could only be loved out of pity or charity. Henry saw her differently, saw her as complete and whole and worthy of love exactly as she was. Quote 996, she whispered. Quote 997, Henry replied. Do 998. As they settled into sleep, Janet felt a peace that went deeper than mere contentment. She had found not just a husband, but a true partner who understood that love was not about perfection, but about accepting and cherishing each other's imperfections as part of the beautiful complexity of being human. The summer passed in a blur of simple pleasures and quiet discoveries. Janet's confidence continued to grow, and she began to take on more challenging tasks around the homestead. She learned to tend the chickens Henry had acquired from a trader, to milk the goat they had purchased for fresh dairy, to preserve vegetables and fruits for the coming winter. But perhaps most importantly, she began to write again. Janet had always loved words, had kept a journal before her marriage to David, and had dreamed of someday writing stories that others might want to read. The blindness had seemed to put an end to such dreams, but Henry had surprised her with a gift that changed everything. Quote 999, she asked when he placed the unfamiliar object in her hands. Quote 1000, Henry said. Quote 1. Janet ran her fingers over the machine, feeling the rows of keys, the smooth roller where paper would be inserted, the intricate mechanism that would translate her thoughts into written words. Quote 1002, she protested. Quote 1003, Henry said simply. Quote fama fariantum. It took weeks of practice before Janet could type with any speed or accuracy, but gradually her fingers learned the location of each key, developed the muscle memory that allowed her to translate thoughts into words without conscious effort. The clicking of the typewriter keys became a familiar sound in the cabin, the rhythm of Janet's writing providing a counterpoint to the crackling of the fire and the whisper of wind through the trees. She began with simple descriptions of her daily life, then moved on to more complex pieces about her experiences with blindness, her journey from despair to hope, her growing understanding of what it meant to live fully despite disability. Read this to me, she would ask Henry when she finished a piece, and he would read her words back to her in his steady, warm voice. This is beautiful, he would say, and Janet could hear the genuine admiration in his tone. You have a gift for putting feelings into words. Do you think anyone else would want to read them? Janet asked one evening after Henry had read her latest piece, a story about learning to navigate the world through touch and sound. I think there are many people who would benefit from reading your words, Henry replied. People who are struggling with their own challenges, their own losses. You could help them see that there is hope even in the darkest times. The idea that her writing might help others filled Janet with a sense of purpose she had not felt since losing her sight. Perhaps her experiences, painful as they had been, could serve a greater good. Perhaps her words could offer hope to others who were struggling to find their way through their own darkness. As autumn approached and the leaves began to change color in ways that Henry described with the increasing poetry, Janet felt a contentment that seemed almost too good to be true. She had a husband who loved her completely, a home that felt like a true sanctuary, meaningful work that gave her a sense of purpose, and a growing confidence in her ability to navigate the world despite her disability. But life, as she had learned, had a way of testing happiness just when it seemed most secure. The first sign of trouble came on a crisp October morning when Henry returned from checking their traps with news that made Janet's blood run cold. Quote 2011, he said, his voice tight with concern. Quote 12. Janet felt the familiar chill of fear that she had hoped never to experience again. Quote 213, quote 14, Henry admitted. Quote 215. The possibility that Rodriguez's death had not ended their troubles had always lingered in the back of Janet's mind like a shadow. The saloon owner had been a man with connections, with business partners who might seek revenge for his death or try to claim what they saw as his property. Quote Janet asked. Quote 17, Henry said grimly. Quote 10. The next few days passed in tense preparation. Henry checked and cleaned all their weapons, while Janet practiced loading and firing the pistol he had taught her to use. They reviewed their escape routes, planned fallback positions, and discussed what they would do if the worst happened. But despite their preparations, Janet found herself hoping that the strangers would prove to be innocent travelers, hunters, or trappers who had no interest in them at all. She had grown to love the peace of their mountain life, the sense of safety and security that had allowed her to heal and grow. The thought of losing it all to violence and pursuit was almost unbearable. The attack came on a Tuesday morning, just as Janet was finishing her breakfast. Henry had gone out to check the snares, and she was alone in the cabin when she heard the sound that made her heart stop. The deliberate crunch of footsteps in the snow outside. Multiple sets of footsteps, moving with the careful coordination of men who knew what they were doing. Janet grabbed the pistol from its hiding place and moved quickly to the position Henry had shown her, behind the heavy wooden table that could provide some protection from gunfire. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she listened to the footsteps circling the cabin, counting at least 4 different sets. Quote 119, a voice called out from outside. Quote to 20. The use of her married name sent a chill through Janet's body. These men knew who she was, had come specifically for her. But how had they found them? And what did they want? We do not want to hurt you, the voice continued. We just want to talk. Janet remained silent, knowing that any response would confirm her presence and give away her position. She gripped the pistol with both hands, trying to remember everything Henry had taught her about using it effectively. Mrs. Garcia, we know your husband killed Kevin Rodriguez, the voice said, and Janet felt her worst fears confirmed. We represent some of Rodriguez's business associates. They want to discuss compensation for their losses. Compensation. The word was a euphemism for revenge, Janet was certain. These men had come to finish what Rodriguez had started, to claim her as payment for their employer's death. Quote 1,025, quote the voice continued. Oh, quote 1226. Janet heard the sound of the front door being tested, the rattle of the latch as someone tried to open it. Henry had reinforced the door after the previous attack, but it would not hold forever against determined men with the right tools. Where was Henry? Janet strained her ears for any sound that might indicate his return, but heard only the voices of the men outside and the sound of tools being applied to the door. Quote, tosser, the voice said closer now. Quote, tone. The door splintered with a crash that made Janet jump. Heavy footsteps entered the cabin, moving carefully but purposefully. Janet held her breath, trying to make herself invisible behind the table. The leader ordered. Janet heard the men spreading out through the cabin, opening doors, overturning furniture. It was only a matter of time before they found her hiding place. Quote 131. One of the men said, and Janet felt rough hands grab her arms, hauling her to her feet. The pistol was torn from her grasp before she could use it, and she found herself being dragged toward what she assumed was the front door. The grip on her arms was painful, deliberately so, a preview of what was to come if she did not cooperate. Quote 1,032, the leader said as she was brought before him. Quote 1033. Quote 10-4, Janet asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite her fear. Quote 10. The man replied. Quote to quote 1037, Janet said. Quote 3, the man said with a laugh that made Janet's skin crawl. You see, we know all about the gold mine your husband has been working. We know about the nuggets he has been hiding away. Janet felt confusion mixed with her fear. What gold mine? What are you talking about? Do not play dumb with us, another voice said. We have been watching this place for weeks. We know Garcia has been taking gold out of the mountain. The accusation was so unexpected that Janet almost laughed despite her terror. Henry had never mentioned anything about gold, had never shown any signs of hidden wealth. Their life was simple, sustained by hunting and trapping and the vegetables from their garden. You are wrong, she said. There is no gold mine. We barely have enough money to buy supplies. Then where does he go every Tuesday and Friday? The leader demanded. Where does he disappear to for hours at a time, carrying that heavy pack? Janet felt a chill of understanding. Henry did leave the cabin twice a week, always with a pack, always for several hours. He had told her he was checking distant trap lines, but now she wondered if there was more to his absences than he had revealed. I do not know, she said honestly. Well, we are going to find out, the leader said, and you are going to help us. Before Janet could ask what he meant, she heard the sound she had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. Henry's voice calling from somewhere outside. The men around her tensed, and Janet felt a gun barrel pressed against her temple. The leader ordered. Quote 1052, quote 1053, Janet said quietly. The gun barrel pressed harder against her skull. Quote 1054. Janet closed her eyes and thought about the man she loved, the life they had built together, the future they had planned. She could save herself by cooperating, could trade Henry's life for her own, or she could refuse and trust that the man who had saved her once before would find a way to save them both. Go to hell, she said. The slap that followed was hard enough to knock her to the ground, her cheek burning with pain. But before the leader could carry out his threat, the world exploded in gunfire and chaos. Henry had not come to surrender. He had come to fight. The battle that followed was brief but intense. Janet pressed herself against the floor as bullets flew overhead, as men shouted and cursed and died around her. She heard Henry's voice, calm and deadly, calling out the tactical instructions to himself as he moved through the cabin like an avenging angel. When the shooting stopped, the silence was deafening. Janet lay still, afraid to move, afraid to hope that it was over. Henry's voice called softly, "It is safe now." She raised her head cautiously, feeling strong hands help her to her feet. Henry's arms came around her, and she buried her face against his chest, breathing in his familiar scent of pine and leather and safety. He asked, his hands moving gently over her face and arms, checking for injuries. Quote 159. Janet said, quote dear sickety. Henry's body went rigid with anger. Which one? It does not matter, Janet said quickly. Are they all dead? Yes, Henry said simply. It is over. But even as relief flooded through her, Janet knew that it was not really over. There would always be more men like these, more people who saw her as property to be claimed or revenge to be taken. The price of their happiness would always be vigilance, always be the willingness to fight for what they had built together. Henry, she said as they held each other in the aftermath of violence. Yes? Those men said you have been mining gold. They said you have been hiding money from me. Henry was quiet for a long moment, and Janet felt a chill of uncertainty. Had her husband been keeping secrets from her? Had their entire life together been built on lies? It is true, Henry said finally. I have been mining gold, but not for the reasons they thought. What do you mean? Henry led her to their bedroom where she heard him moving something heavy. A moment later, he placed a small bag in her hands. It was surprisingly heavy, and when she opened it, she felt the smooth, cold weight of what could only be gold nuggets. I have been saving this for you, Henry said quietly. For us. I wanted to have enough money set aside so that if anything ever happened to me, you would be provided for. The explanation hit Janet like a physical blow. Henry had been working in secret, not to hide wealth from her, but to ensure her security. He had been thinking about her future, planning for the possibility that she might someday be alone again. You should have told me, she said, though her voice held no anger. I wanted to surprise you, Henry admitted. I was planning to tell you everything on our first wedding anniversary. I thought we could use the money to build a bigger cabin, maybe even travel somewhere you have always wanted to go. Janet felt tears sliding down her cheeks as she understood the depth of Henry's love for her. Even in their happiness, he had been thinking ahead, planning for her welfare, working to ensure that she would never again face the kind of poverty and desperation that had made her vulnerable to men like Rodriguez. Quote 157, she said softly. Quote 178. Quote 179, Henry replied. Quote 180. As they cleaned up the aftermath of the attack and prepared to bury the men who had tried to destroy their peace, Janet reflected on the strange turns her life continued to take. She had thought that Rodriguez's death would end their troubles, but it seemed that happiness always came with a price, that peace had to be fought for and defended. But she was no longer the helpless woman who had stumbled blind through a Colorado snowstorm. She was Janet Garcia, wife of Henry Garcia, and she would fight for their life together with every breath in her body. The gold her husband had been saving was just a symbol of something much more valuable. The love and commitment that bound them together, the willingness to sacrifice for each other's welfare, the determination to build something beautiful in a world that often seemed determined to destroy it. Winter came early that year, arriving in November with a fury that reminded Janet of the storm that had nearly killed her just over a year before. But this time she faced the cold and snow from the warmth and safety of a home she had helped to build, beside a man who loved her completely. The cabin felt different now, larger somehow, though Henry had not yet begun the expansion he had planned. Perhaps it was simply that Janet's understanding of the space had grown, that her mental map of their home had become so detailed and complete that she could navigate it as easily as a sighted person. Or perhaps it was the knowledge that this was truly her home, not just a refuge or a temporary shelter, but the place where she belonged and would always be welcome. The snow is coming down hard, Henry observed as he came in from checking on their animals. We might be snowed in for a few days. Janet smiled at the prospect. Being snowed in with Henry was no hardship. It meant long evenings by the fire, quiet conversations about their plans and dreams, the simple pleasure of being together, without the distractions of daily chores. I finished the story about the waterfall, she said, gesturing toward the typewriter where her latest piece waited. Would you like to hear it? Always, Henry replied, settling into his chair beside the fire. Janet had been working on a series of stories about her experiences with blindness, writing them with the hope that they might someday be published and help others who were facing similar challenges. The waterfall story was one of her favorites, a meditation on the different ways of experiencing beauty and the gifts that could come from losing one sense and developing others. She read the story aloud, her voice growing more confident with each paragraph. Writing had become more than just a hobby for her. It was a way of processing her experiences, of finding meaning in the struggles she had endured, of reaching out to others who might be walking similar paths. That is beautiful, Henry said when she finished. You have a real talent for this, Janet. People need to read your words. Do you really think so? I know so, Henry said firmly. In fact, I have been thinking about that. What would you say to a trip to Denver in the spring? We could visit some newspaper editors, maybe find a publisher who would be interested in your work. The suggestion took Janet by surprise. Denver was a big city, full of strangers and noise and complications she had learned to live without. The thought of leaving their mountain sanctuary was both exciting and terrifying. Do you think I could handle a city? She asked. I think you can handle anything, Henry replied. You have already proven that. But we would take it slowly, stay in a good hotel, take our time getting used to the bustle and noise. Janet considered the possibility. Her writing had become increasingly important to her, and the idea that it might reach a wider audience was appealing. But more than that, the suggestion represented Henry's confidence in her abilities, his belief that she was ready to face new challenges. She said finally, quote 1 in 95. They spent the evening planning the hypothetical trip, discussing what Janet would need to pack, how they would travel, what they hoped to accomplish. It was the kind of conversation that would have seemed impossible a year ago when Janet could barely navigate from the bedroom to the kitchen without help. Now the idea of traveling to a major city, of meeting with editors and publishers, of sharing her story with the world, seemed not just possible but inevitable. She had come so far from the broken woman who had been abandoned by a wagon train, had grown so much in confidence and capability. She said as they prepared for bed, Henry considered the question seriously. Dawn wine, he said honestly. Quote is for 1100. Quote man on and quote on, Henry said. Quote. The words touched Janet's heart in ways that simple declarations of love could not. She understood what Henry meant about the difference between living and surviving, had experienced it herself in the months before she met him. We saved each other, she said quietly. Yes, Henry agreed. We did. As winter deepened and the snow piled higher around their cabin, Janet found herself reflecting on the year that had passed since their wedding. It had been a year of growth and discovery, of challenges overcome and love deepened. She had learned to see herself not as a disabled woman who needed care, but as a complete person who happened to be blind. The distinction was important. It was the difference between defining herself by what she could not do and defining herself by what she could accomplish. And she had accomplished so much more than she had ever thought possible. She could cook elaborate meals, tend a garden, care for animals, navigate mountain trails, defend herself with a weapon, and write stories that move people to tears. Her blindness was still a part of her daily reality, but it was no longer the most important thing about her. I want to tell you something, she said to Henry one evening as they sat by the fire. What is that? I am grateful for my blindness, Janet said, the words coming slowly but with deep conviction. Not grateful that I lost my sight, but grateful for what losing my sight taught me. Henry waited for her to continue, understanding that this was something she needed to say in her own way. If I had never gone blind, I would never have been on that wagon train, Janet continued, I would never have been abandoned in the mountains. I would never have stumbled through that snowstorm and found your cabin. You would have had a different life, Henry said. A lesser life, Janet said firmly. A life without you, without this place, without the understanding of what I am truly capable of. My blindness led me to everything that matters most to me. It was a profound realization, one that had been building in Janet's mind for months. Her disability, which had once seemed like the worst thing that could happen to her, had actually been the catalyst for the best things in her life. Quote, one says, and Henry said softly. Quote, Janet said, what? Quote, one, and as spring approached and they began to plan their trip to Denver, Janet felt a sense of anticipation that had nothing to do with fear or anxiety. She was ready to face the world again, ready to share her story and help others who might be struggling with their own challenges. The blind woman who had once seen her disability as the end of everything had become a woman who understood that every ending was also a beginning, that every loss carried within it the seeds of unexpected gifts. She had lost her sight, but she had gained so much more: love, purpose, confidence, and the unshakable knowledge that she was capable of far more than she had ever imagined. The darkness that had once terrified her had become a different kind of light, illuminating truths about herself and the world that she might never have discovered otherwise. And beside her, every step of the way, was the man who had seen her potential when she could not see it herself, who had loved her not despite her blindness, but as a complete person who happened to navigate the world differently. Together, they had built something beautiful from the ruins of their separate tragedies. Together, they would face whatever challenges the future might bring. The mountain winter might be cold and harsh, but inside their cabin, warmed by love and hope and the unbreakable bond between two souls who had found their perfect match, spring was already beginning to bloom. The journey to Denver in late May was everything Janet had hoped it would be and more. Henry had arranged for them to travel by train from the nearest station, a new experience for Janet that filled her with wonder and excitement. The rhythmic clacking of wheels on rails, the whistle of the locomotive, the conversations of fellow passengers all combined to create a symphony of civilization that was both overwhelming and exhilarating. Quote twain, Janet said as they settled into their seats for the long journey. Quote wondering. Henry replied, his voice taking on the poetic quality it always had when he described the world for her. Quote she know. Janet pressed her face to the window, feeling the vibration of the train through the glass, imagining the scenery that Henry painted with his words. She was leaving the mountain sanctuary that had become her whole world, but she was not afraid. She was ready for this adventure, ready to share her story with people who might need to hear it. The hotel in Denver was a revelation of luxury that Janet had never experienced before. Their room had electric lights, running water, and a telephone that Henry demonstrated with obvious pride. But perhaps most importantly, it had a writing desk where Janet could set up her typewriter and work on the stories she hoped to share with publishers. Quote 1123, Henry said as they settled in for their first night in the city. Quote 1124 on. Quote 1125 con, Janet asked. Quote 11261, Henry admitted. Quote 1127. The meeting with a newspaper editor, a kindly man named Henry Rogers, exceeded all of Janet's expectations. He had read her stories with genuine enthusiasm and had specific ideas about how they might be published and promoted. Your writing has a quality that is very rare, Rogers told Ear as they sat in his office overlooking the busy streets of Denver. You write about hardship and disability without self-pity, with honesty, but also with hope. That is exactly what people need to read. Do you think there is really an audience for stories about blindness? Janet asked. I think there is an audience for stories about overcoming adversity, Rogers replied, about finding strength in unexpected places, about love, conquering all obstacles. Your blindness is part of your story, but it is not the whole story. Over the course of the week they spent in Denver, Janet met with several editors and publishers, each one more enthusiastic than the last about her work. By the time they were ready to return home, she had signed a contract for a series of articles to be published in the Denver Post and had received a commitment from a book publisher to consider a collection of her stories. I cannot believe this is really happening, Janet said as they boarded the train for home. I can, Henry replied. I have always known you were destined for great things. The return journey gave Janet time to process everything that had happened during their week in the city. She had proven to herself that she could navigate the complexities of urban life, could conduct business meetings and negotiate contracts, could function as a professional writer despite her disability. But perhaps more importantly, she had discovered that her story resonated with people, that her experiences could indeed help others who were facing their own challenges. The editor had told her about letters he had received from readers who had been inspired by the sample stories she had submitted, people who had found hope and encouragement in her words. I want to write more, she told Henry, as they watched the familiar mountains grow larger on the horizon. Not just about blindness, but about all kinds of challenges people face, about love and loss and finding hope in dark places. Then that is what you will do, Henry said simply. As their train pulled into the station and they began the final leg of their journey home, Janet felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with reaching their destination. She had come full circle from the broken woman who had stumbled through a snowstorm to the confident writer who was ready to share her story with the world. The cabin that welcomed them back felt both familiar and new, as if their time away had allowed her to see it with fresh eyes. This was still her sanctuary, her home, the place where she had learned to live and love again. But it was no longer a hiding place. It was a foundation, a base from which she could reach out to touch other lives. "Welcome home, Mrs. Garcia," Henry said as they stood together on the porch, breathing in the familiar scent of pine and mountain air. "Welcome home, Mr. Garcia," Janet replied, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The summer that followed was one of the most productive of Janet's life. She wrote constantly, producing story after story about her experiences and the experiences of others she had met along the way. The articles that appeared in the Denver Post generated an enormous response, with letters pouring in from readers who had been touched by her words. One letter in particular moved Janet to tears when Henry read it to her. It was from a woman named Carolyn Hughes, whose daughter Lisa had been born blind and who had been struggling with despair about her child's future. "Your stories have given me hope," the woman had written. "They have shown me that my daughter can live a full and meaningful life, that her blindness does not have to define her limitations. Thank you for helping me see that love and determination can overcome any obstacle." "This is why you write," Henry said when he finished reading the letter. "This is why your words matter." Janet nodded, understanding more clearly than ever the responsibility that came with her gift. She was not just telling her own story, she was speaking for everyone who had ever faced what seemed like insurmountable challenges, everyone who had ever been told that their dreams were impossible. As autumn approached and the leaves began to change color in the familiar cycle of mountain seasons, Janet received news that would change their lives once again. The book publisher who had been considering her collection of stories had not only accepted it for publication, but had offered her a substantial advance and a contract for additional books. "You are going to be a published author," Henry said, his voice filled with pride and amazement. "Your words are going to reach people all over the country." "Our words," Janet corrected. "None of this would have been possible without you. You saved my life. You taught me to see the world differently. You believed in me when I could not believe in myself." "And you saved mine," Henry replied. "You gave me a reason to live again, a purpose beyond just surviving from day to day." As they sat together by the fire that night, planning the future that stretched out before them bright with possibility, Janet reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. She had lost her sight, her security, her old life, everything she thought she needed to be happy. In return, she had found love, purpose, confidence, and the knowledge that she was capable of far more than she had ever imagined. She had discovered that strength came not from what you could see, but from how clearly you could envision your dreams and how determined you were to pursue them. The blind woman who had once seen her disability as the end of everything had become a woman who understood that every ending was also a beginning, that every loss carried within it the seeds of unexpected gifts. She had learned to see with her heart instead of her eyes, to navigate by love instead of sight, to find light in the deepest darkness. And beside her every step of the way was the man who had seen her potential when she could not see it herself, who had loved her not despite her blindness, but as a complete person who happened to experience the world differently. Together, they had built something beautiful from the ruins of their separate tragedies. Together, they would face whatever challenges and opportunities the future might bring. The mountain that had once seemed like the end of the world had become the beginning of everything that mattered. And in the cabin that had been her refuge, her school, and her sanctuary, Janet Garcia began to write the next chapter of a story that was far from over. 2 years later, Janet stood on the porch of their expanded cabin, feeling the morning sun warm her face as she listened to the sounds of their transformed life. The success of her first book had exceeded everyone's expectations, leading to speaking engagements, more book contracts, and a steady stream of correspondence from readers whose lives had been touched by her words. But perhaps the most wonderful change was the sound she heard now, the laughter of children playing in the yard below. 51. Henry called out to the 3 young visitors who had come to spend the summer with them. Quote, "One moment, 2." The children, all students at a school for the blind in Denver, had come to the mountains as part of a program Janet had helped to establish. They were learning the same skills she had mastered: how to navigate the world through senses other than sight, how to find confidence and independence despite their disability, how to see their blindness not as a limitation, but as a different way of experiencing life. Quote, 153, called 8-year-old Sharon Ramos, the youngest of their current group. Quote, 1150 from quote, 1155. Janet promised, smiling at the eagerness in the child's voice. Right now, you need to help Mr. Garcia with the garden. Janet had discovered that she had a natural talent for teaching, for helping others learn the skills that had once seemed so impossible to master. The children who came to stay with them left with more than just practical abilities. They left with confidence, with hope, with the knowledge that they could accomplish anything they set their minds to. The mail came, Henry said, climbing the steps to join her on the porch. Another letter from your publisher, and something from that woman in Boston who wants to start a school. Janet felt a familiar thrill of excitement. Her second book had been even more successful than the first, and now she was being consulted by educators and advocates across the country who were working to improve opportunities for people with disabilities. Read me the one from Boston, she said, settling into the rocking chair Henry had made for her. The letter was from Frances Edwards, a wealthy widow whose son had lost his sight in an accident and who wanted to establish a school that would use Janet's methods and philosophy. She was offering to fund a substantial facility and was asking Janet to serve as its director. Henry asked when he finished reading. Janet considered the offer carefully. It was an incredible opportunity, a chance to help hundreds of children instead of just the few they could accommodate in their mountain retreat. But it would also mean leaving the place that had become so precious to them, the sanctuary where they had built their life together. She said finally. That evening, after the children had been settled for the night, Janet and Henry sat by the fire and discussed the momentous decision they faced. The offer from Boston was generous beyond their wildest dreams, but it would require them to give up the life they had built in the mountains. Quote, when this is two? Henry asked. Quote, 63, and Janet admitted. Quote, 11, quote, 1. Henry pressed gently. Quote, Wes, it was a question that cut to the heart of everything Janet had learned about herself over the past few years. She had discovered that her greatest growth had come from taking risks, from pushing beyond her comfort zone, from refusing to let fear dictate her choices. Quote, 107, she said quietly. Quote, what doesn't? Henry said simply. The decision to accept the position in Boston was not easy, but once it was made, Janet felt a sense of rightness about it that confirmed her choice. They would be leaving their mountain sanctuary, but they would be taking with them everything that truly mattered: their love for each other, their commitment to helping others, their hard-won wisdom about what it meant to live fully despite adversity. The months that followed were a whirlwind of preparation. Janet worked with Frances Edwards to design the curriculum for the new school, drawing on everything she had learned about teaching children to navigate the world without sight. Henry made arrangements to sell their property to a family who promised to preserve the cabin and the garden they had built with such love. Quote 169. Janet asked on their last night in the mountains as they sat together listening to the familiar sounds of wind through the pines. Quote 1170. Henry replied. Quote 1170. The Frances Edwards School for the Blind opened its doors in September, with Janet serving as its first director and Henry as its groundskeeper and practical skills instructor. The facility was beautiful, with gardens and workshops and dormitories designed specifically for students who would navigate them without sight. But more than the physical beauty of the place, it was the atmosphere of hope and possibility that made the school special. Janet had insisted that every aspect of the program be built around the principle that blindness was not a tragedy to be pitied, but simply a different way of experiencing the world. Quote 102, Janet said to the first group of students on opening day. Quote 173, the success of the school exceeded even Francis Edwards's optimistic expectations. Students who arrived broken and defeated left confident and capable, ready to take their place in the world as productive, independent adults. Word of the school's innovative methods spread, and soon educators from around the world were coming to observe and learn. Janet's third book, about her experiences establishing and running the school, became her most successful yet. She began traveling to speak at conferences and universities, sharing her message of hope and possibility with audiences who had never considered that disability might be anything other than a limitation. You have become famous, Henry observed one evening as they walked through the school's gardens, listening to the sounds of students practicing their mobility skills. We have become useful, Janet corrected, and that is much better than famous. It was true, the measure of their success was not in the accolades or the recognition, but in the lives they had touched, the students who had found confidence and purpose, the families who had discovered hope where they had once seen only despair. As their fifth anniversary approached, Janet found herself reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought them from a remote mountain cabin to one of the most respected educational institutions in the country. She had come so far from the broken woman who had stumbled through a Colorado snowstorm, had accomplished things she could never have imagined when she first lost her sight. Do you ever miss the mountains? Henry asked one evening as they sat in their comfortable apartment above the school. Every day, Janet admitted, but I do not regret leaving them. We brought the best of what we learned there with us, and we are using it to help others find their own way. And we can always go back, Henry said. The mountains will be there when we are ready for them again. Janet smiled at the thought. Someday, perhaps, they would return to the simple life they had built in the wilderness. But for now, they had work to do, lives to touch, hope to share with those who needed it most. The blind woman who had once seen her disability as the end of everything had become a beacon of hope for thousands of others facing their own challenges. She had learned that strength came not from what you could see, but from how clearly you could envision your dreams and how determined you were to pursue them. And beside her every step of the way was the man who had seen her potential when she could not see it herself, who had loved her not despite her blindness, but as a complete person who happened to experience the world differently. Together, they had built something beautiful from the ruins of their separate tragedies. Together, they continued to face whatever challenges and opportunities the future might bring, knowing that love and determination could indeed overcome any obstacle. The darkness that had once seemed like the end of everything had become the foundation for a life of purpose and meaning beyond anything either of them had ever dreamed possible. And in that darkness, illuminated by love and hope, and the unshakable bond between two souls who had found their perfect match, they continued to write a story that inspired others to believe in their own possibilities. In the garden of the strange school they had built together, where students learned to navigate the world through senses other than sight, where hope bloomed as surely as the flowers Henry tended with such care, Janet Garcia stood as living proof that every ending was also a beginning, that every loss carried within it the seeds of unexpected gifts. The mountain man had taken her hand and shown her how love could transform even the deepest darkness into light. Now, together, they were helping others discover the same truth, one student at a time, one life at a time, one act of love and faith at a time. The story that had begun with a blind woman stumbling through a snowstorm had become a testament to the power of human resilience, the strength of love, and the infinite possibilities that existed for those brave enough to reach for them. And it was far from over.